Chapter 111 Suspicious Duo. If there was one thing Michael liked about dealing with unfamiliar people in places he wandered into to handle business, it was how quickly they got to the point. On the flip side, what he hated was the difficulty of effective negotiation with strangers in such settings. There were pros and cons, but in the association, it hardly mattered now. He was here to sell, not buy. If he had wanted to purchase something, he'd have preferred to deal with Brian, or worse, the middle-aged man who had attended to him earlier in the afternoon. CTHU novel F. IR.net website on Google to access chapters of novels early and in the highest quality. As he liked, the trade center staff quickly got to the point. After nearly an hour of trade, Michael sold the corpses he'd brought earlier in the day. Though the sale didn't significantly boost his account balance, which still hovered around $2 million, it was a nice profit for something he had picked up and returned. With his business at the association concluded, Michael headed back to his hotel, taking the same route he'd used to get to the Supers Association branch. Dark alleys. Moments later, Michael arrived at the hotel entrance, only to encounter a familiar face, or at least somewhat familiar. It was a stretch to call it that since he'd only seen the man once about an hour ago. It was the man who happened to be staying in the room opposite his. As their eyes met, the man frowned, though he quickly masked it with a polite smile. Michael, however, had already noticed the initial reaction. What puzzled him more was the faint hostility he sensed, not from the middle-aged man, but from his companion beside him. Even more intriguing was the familiar aura emanating from the other person. Two supernaturals? Michael murmured to himself. He wasn't surprised to learn he shared the hotel with at least two other supernaturals. Supernaturals were still human. After all, just more adept at hiding themselves from the average society while continuing to live their lives. It wasn't unusual to see supernaturals in public, though Michael rarely encountered them. Before his advancement to rank 1, he wouldn't have even noticed if a supernatural passed him, unless he used Detect, which he had stopped doing after his unnerving experience with Brian. Now, however, with his advancement, everything about him had improved, including aspects not shown on the status panel. Michael no longer needed Detect to recognize a supernatural being, as long as they weren't far stronger than him and had excellent control over their mana and aura. At the moment, though, none of this mattered. What puzzled Michael was the faint hostility he'd sensed earlier from the companion of the man he'd met an hour ago. It didn't make any sense. The hostility had disappeared as quickly as it appeared, but Michael trusted his instincts. His senses weren't playing tricks on him. Despite his confusion, Michael didn't linger. After returning a polite nod to the man from earlier and briefly greeting the companion, who, for some reason, greeted him first, Michael continued on his way. At least, that's how it appeared on the surface. The moment Michael reached a secluded corner, he leaned his back against the wall and exhaled slowly. Without hesitation, he connected his consciousness to the land of origin. When he opened his eyes in the other world, he was seated cross-legged, exactly as he had been before returning to the real world. Wasting no time, Michael turned to the two undead perched on his shoulders. On his right was the undead Phantomorpho, the only one of its kind under his command, which he had named Blue. On his left sat the undead Spicebush Swallowtail Moth, another unique undead, Purple. With a quick glance at both, Michael stored them in his mark of origin. Taking a deep breath, he closed his eyes again and reconnected with the real world. Barely a few seconds had passed. Nothing appeared to have changed. Michael scanned his surroundings, confirming no one was paying attention. Discreetly, he stretched out his palms, summoning the two undead he had just stored. They hovered silently above his hands. What was Michael doing? Initially, he had planned to mind his own business, but something about those two men felt off. Deeply suspicious. Yet even that wouldn't have been enough for him to act. It wasn't until he passed them earlier that he realized why their auras felt so familiar. It was a sensation Michael knew intimately, ever since his first undead. The energy of death. While Michael wasn't one to equate death energy with evil, he himself wielded it. However, something about the death energy surrounding those two was deeply unsettling. It felt ominous, resentful. Also, it was like the moment he finally recognized the energy seemed to call out to him. Michael wasn't sure, but a part of him knew he had heard several voices called out to him in an instant. For the first time since his awakening, Michael felt the true workings of his class, the abilities not listed on his status panel. Idiot! Were you trying to alert him? The older of the two men snapped angrily as soon as they stepped outside the hotel. He clearly seemed to be the leader. Sorry, the second man replied meekly, his head lowered. I couldn't help myself. We're finally so close to our goal, and seeing a variable like that made me lose my composure for a moment. The older man's scowl deepened, his breathing heavy with restrained frustration. He took a moment to compose himself before speaking. That boy is not any weaker than us, he said firmly. I was surprised, too, when I encountered him outside our rooms. He's the one responsible for that earlier disturbance. I don't know why his mana signature is so similar to the man the higher-ups assigned us, nor why he doesn't bother fully suppressing his mana. But listen to me, he's a strong variable. Didn't I tell you to be cautious around him? I'm sorry, the other man murmured again, guilt evident in his tone. Just be careful. I know how excited you are about advancing, and your hatred for these so-called modern cultivators who choose to be controlled like lambs instead of reigning as kings. But tonight is critical. We can't afford any mistakes. Understand? I understand, the second man said quietly. But still, that boy. He looks so young, yet so powerful. Do you think he's an awakener? I doubt it. He seems too old. If he were an awakener, someone his age would be able to crush us effortlessly. I wouldn't have even sensed his mana unless he wanted me to. It's better not to dwell on it. He's likely just some prodigy from a powerful force. More like a drug-enhanced prodigy, the other man muttered under his breath. Whatever he is, he's none of our business, the leader replied coldly. Besides, he'll be dead soon enough. The two men didn't even consider the possibility that Michael was one of the rare new awakeners who had recently passed their ceremony. Unlike Grace, who worked within the Supers Association, these men were clueless. But even Grace had thought of Michael's progress to be extremely fast. To the two duo, however, Michael was simply a strong youth with a vaguely familiar aura. Chapter 112, Trailing the Suspicious Duo. Death was often associated with evil, treated as though it were inherently bad. But it wasn't. To put it simply, it was just another part of life. All things eventually came to an end. Even immortality was a fallacy. Unless, of course, one was a true god. Of course, such lofty philosophy was far from Michael's current understanding. Even as a necromancer, he still viewed death as a bad thing. A true practitioner of death would embrace it fully. Then again, that was a true practitioner. Anyone could practice something and excel at it, but grasping its true essence was rare. Without systematic training or mentorship, almost everything Michael knew about the supernatural was self-taught. Even now, he wasn't certain if death energy was the correct term, but sensing the familiar aura between him and those two men made it feel appropriate. Michael had read on forums that the panel only Awakeners could see served more as a summary of one's abilities than a comprehensive list. Now, he fully understood a part of it, because nowhere on the forum did it mention that an Awakener necromancer could hear voices from something as ethereal as energy. Why does their energy feel so evil? In truth, Michael already had an inkling of why that might be the case. He simply didn't want to accept it. Both Michaels, the one from Earth and the one from this world, though the former was more experienced in life, hadn't encountered truly dark forces. Almost all supernaturals had blood on their hands, partly from slaying monsters, which meant nearly all of them carried a trace of death energy. This imbued them with a unique presence that other supernaturals could sense. However, as a necromancer, Michael was more attuned to certain energies than even those stronger than him, which was the reason this time the energy surrounding those two supernaturals stood out way more to him as it was different. Despite his inner tremors, Michael proceeded with his plan. Undead Phantom Morpho LV2. Rank Common. Undead Spicebush Swallowtail Moth LV2. Rank Common. Just as the panel didn't reveal the full capabilities of an Awakener, it often fell short when assessing monsters. Take Michael's Spectral Ant, for example. One would be in serious trouble if they approached it assuming the panel showed all it was capable of, only to be met with its 2-ton strength. Both were illusionary creatures that seemed like illusions themselves, even without using their skills. Of course, with their current strength, it was relatively easy for a powerful supernatural to detect them despite their racial abilities. However, the key was whether that supernatural cared enough to pay attention. In this scenario, the weakness of the two undead became Michael's strength, or rather, his perfect tools for spying on the suspicious ones. The small size of the undead Phantomorpho and the undead Spicebush Swallowtail Moth was also a significant advantage. Go! Michael commanded the two undead, and they flew away from him towards the hotel building's exit, which also served as the entrance. Strangely, although the two flying undead were small in size, much like butterflies, when they passed in front of someone, it seemed as if they couldn't be seen, creating an eerie situation. The moment the two undead left him, Michael activated his skill, Share Senses, without hesitation. At its basic mastery, the skill allowed him to link to the senses of two undead within a 100-meter radius, which suited him perfectly. His current abilities only let him control undead within a 300-meter range, and the farther they were, the weaker his control became. For now, 100 meters was the sweet spot, assuming the targets remained within range. Those two are strong, Michael thought as his senses flared. However, he didn't feel an overwhelming threat. He estimated that he could handle either one individually, but taking them both down at once would be a challenge. Not that it mattered. Michael was never the type to fight solo. He was a necromancer, an exceptional one at that. The undead Phantomorpho and undead Spicebush Swallowtail Moth flitted out of the hotel, with Michael trailing behind them. Relying on his enhanced senses to navigate, he moved as though he could see everything clearly. His previous runs to, and from the Supers Association branch, had taught him how much he could trust his senses. His sensory perception was sharpest within a 20-meter radius, and for day-to-day use, this was more than enough. Although this was his first time using his senses in such a scenario, he wielded the ability as naturally as if he'd been born with it. By moving in sync with his undead, Michael ensured he stayed within the optimal range where shared senses worked seamlessly. It had been more than 200 years since the Dark Age, when monsters reigned and demonic supernaturals ran rampant. Now, 2 centuries later, the world was far more at peace and had even surpassed its pre-Dark Age state in terms of technological and societal advancement, or so most people in Aurora believed. However, only a select few knew the truth. The dangers of the past hadn't disappeared. If anything, they had grown stronger. Most ordinary citizens didn't even know what a demonic cultivator was. This ignorance was largely due to the Federation's efforts to keep such matters under wraps, often attributing incidents involving demonic cultivators to sudden cracks or crack outbreaks, much to the frustration of the demonic faction. Even after 200 years, Aurora remained divided into 3 main factions: the righteous faction, the demonic faction, and the neutral faction. However, in reality, traces of each faction could be found within the others. The Federation was the public representative of the righteous faction. Though primarily focused on protecting the innocent and maintaining order, some members secretly engage in practices considered morally gray. The demonic faction, despite its foundation in chaos and the pursuit of power through darker means, had individuals who adopted more moderate methods. Some even harbored twisted yet righteous tendencies. The neutral faction, dedicated to maintaining balance, often housed individuals with personal ties to both the righteous and demonic factions. These crossovers made the political landscape of Aurora complex and fraught with hidden agendas. All of this was far removed from Michael's current concerns. His future remained unpredictable, but tonight would mark the first time he dabbled in the deep waters of his new world. If there was one thing demonic cultivators sought, it was power, and the freedom to wield it and get it without restraint. They saw themselves as superior beings, destined to rule, submitting only to the stronger fist. Yet, they lived worse than the weak they so despised. Since their emergence, demonic supernaturals have been suppressed repeatedly, their struggle resembling that of hyenas against lions. However, after years of suppression and enduring defeat, they were finally ready to return in force. It took Michael some time to adjust to the vision of his undead Phantomorpho and Spicebush Swallowtail Moth. Though still limited to a monochrome world, connecting to their sight felt like viewing the world in 360 degrees through countless cameras. The dual connection made it even more disorienting. Fortunately, Michael's high intelligence provided him with the computational power to handle it. After a while, he managed to make sense of the dual vision filled with multiple angles. Fortunately, it seemed the suspicious duo's activities were confined to the hotel's surroundings, not far away. If they truly intended to leave, Michael knew there was little he could do to stop them. Following the duo, Michael studied their movements to try and discern what they planned to do. He quickly noticed something odd. Almost every few meters, the two dropped an odd-looking object on the floor in a specific pattern. When Michael first saw it, he quickly used Detect on the oddly shaped item that looked like a stone. Demon remains. A remnant of the flesh of a low-level demon. Demon? Remains. The 2 items together didn't seem like a good thing. What was worse was that in his hesitation to find out whether he should pick up whatever it was in front of him, the remains of the demon seemed to dissolve into the ground and disappeared. It didn't only happen once. As Michael continued to trail after the 2 suspicious individuals, the same experience he had with the first one made Michael feel a little scared, yet very apprehensive towards touching the demon remains. It didn't really seem like a bright idea to touch them, but it also didn't seem like a good idea to let those 2 continue, as it didn't seem like they were up to good things. At least, he didn't see anything good from their actions. Throwing some sort of monster remains was enough suspicion that these 2 were definitely not doing community service. However, stopping them in public, even at night when there were still quite a number of people on the road, and even without this, a larger number of people residing in the buildings around them, might lead to a fight that would cause public destruction, which was something Michael didn't want. For a moment, he was conflicted. Chapter 113, Impending Doom. Mid-thought, an idea suddenly struck Michael. No, a realization. What am I even doing? Isn't the association responsible for handling supernatural affairs? For a moment, Michael felt stupid. It was clear that even with enhanced cognitive abilities, high mental processing power didn't equate to perfect intelligence. Then again, smart was a subjective term. Not everyone could have handled the current situation as well as Michael did, even if they had better resources. After the realization hit him that he was concerning himself with matters far outside his paycheck, something he didn't even have, Michael immediately pulled out his phone. He had a new plan to inform the association. The Supers Association had its own hotline, with each branch maintaining specific numbers. However, like most regular people, Michael hadn't memorized it. If it wasn't the police hotline, it wasn't exactly common knowledge. Okay, that wasn't entirely true. Michael could have easily searched the number online, but instead, he scrolled through his contacts for one person who'd reached out to him earlier that day. Grace. She had called him about his advancement, and since they weren't familiar enough for personal calls, she must have used one of the association's official lines. Besides, it was easy to distinguish between regular contacts and those that weren't. Trailing behind the suspicious duo through dark alleyways, Michael did his best to suppress his presence, sweat trickling down his back. He located the contact and dialed it. Ring, ring. The call connected almost instantly. A calm, yet serious male voice came through the line. Hello, this is the Supers Association. Who am I speaking with, and how can I help you today? Good morning. I'm Michael Norman, and I have something to report, Michael said in a low, measured tone. Please, go ahead. Wait, demon remains? Yes. And how do you know that? The voice grew skeptical, but also more serious. I'm an awakener. It's one of my skills. I see. And you say the remains are dissolving into the ground? Yes. This sounds beyond my jurisdiction. Please hold for a moment. I'll be right back. The man's voice became hurried, and Michael could hear rapid movement in the background. Before he could respond, the line went quiet. Michael sighed. The reaction only confirmed what he already suspected. This wasn't a simple matter. Demons? His tone changed as soon as I mentioned it. What's really going on here? He muttered. Before he could think further, a different voice came through the phone, one he instantly recognized. Speak. Repeat what you just said. Teacher Brian? Michael was taken aback. It was indeed the voice of Brian from the Trade Center. You? Brian sounded equally surprised, but quickly returned to his usual businesslike tone. Where are you? Michael described the hotel and its surroundings, providing as much detail as possible. Although the suspicious duo had moved away, the hotel remained the most recognizable landmark. Once Michael finished, the call abruptly ended, leaving him stunned. What now? He muttered, unsure of his next move. He was about to link his vision back to his undead when a voice suddenly spoke beside him. This is quite a good hiding spot. Michael's heart jumped, and his body reacted instinctively. He swung his hand toward the source of the voice, but it was caught effortlessly with a force that nullified any power it had. Good instincts, the voice said calmly, but poor form and terrible strength distribution, probably due to having so much. Michael's eyelid twitched as he turned to see who it was. You're fast, Teacher Brian. Brian nodded slightly, releasing his grip on Michael's wrist. Brian turned his head slightly, scanning the area like he was searching for something specific. Michael noticed him fixating on the direction where the two suspicious men had headed, the same direction where his undead were trailing them. No wonder we couldn't locate them for long. They're using advanced aura suppression arts. You'd have to get quite close to detect the subtle differences, Brian muttered aloud. Michael listened intently. He knew what arts were in the cultivation world, techniques that utilized one's mana to produce various effects. From Brian's words, Michael understood that the two men were likely bad people, given their actions and reliance on aura hiding techniques. How did you manage to find them when our men couldn't? Brian asked, his tone curious. Michael hesitated, confused about why they weren't pursuing the suspects immediately. Their aura, it felt very ominous. Ominous? In what way? It felt resentful. The death energy around them didn't seem like something you'd get just from killing monsters. Brian narrowed his eyes. That depends. After all, not every monster comes from crack. Michael blinked, puzzled by the cryptic response. Just continue, Brian urged, his tone brisk. Michael adjusted his thoughts before speaking. The death energy around them, he began, pausing under Brian's intense, unreadable gaze. It spoke, and for some reason, I knew it didn't come from monsters. It came from humans? Yes. Then they're demonic cultivators. Michael's eyes widened in shock. He'd suspected something dark about the duo, but didn't dare to conclude. Now, learning they were part of a group responsible for nationwide crises and mass sacrifices 2 centuries ago left him shaken. Brian didn't give him time to dwell on the revelation. Interesting method you've got there. But don't be too quick to assume someone's guilty just because of what you sense. As an awakener, I'm guessing your class allows you to detect certain things others can't, but it still depends on you to discern what is actually as it seems. Michael frowned. But you just said they're demonic cultivators. Isn't it possible you're wrong? Oh, I'm not wrong. Brian raised his hand toward the sky, and Michael, puzzled, followed his gaze. What he saw made his breath catch. The sky was riddled with cracks. Familiar cracks Michael couldn't be any more familiar with. They were dimensional cracks. And looking at their appearance, they were corrupted type cracks. Worse, their corrupted edges tinged with a faint red glow. A clear sign of an impending crack break. To think, even after all our efforts, they'd still succeed. Those damned demons, Brian muttered bitterly. Can't we stop it? As long as nothing comes out, there's still a chance, right? Michael asked, his voice tinged with urgency. He wasn't naive. He didn't know why cracks would suddenly appear in the sky, but he understood the stakes. If those cracks broke, half the city, if not the entire city, would fall. The chaotic energy in the sky intensified, growing from a faint hum to levels surpassing what Michael had felt even near a level 2 crack. Michael hastily linked his senses to his undead phantom, Morpho, and his undead spicebush swallowtail moth. His heart sank as he saw what they had discovered. The two men had activated a magic circle in a secluded alley while Michael was distracted, speaking with the association. It was obvious everything had been planned in advance, and Michael hadn't been able to stop it. No wonder Brian hadn't bothered chasing them. It was already too late. There's nothing you can do to stop a dimensional crack from opening, except, Michael interjected sharply, desperation evident in his voice. Brian wasn't offended. Instead, for the first time, Michael saw a clear expression on the man's face, one of yearning. Except if you were a god, Brian said quietly. Stopping a crack? It's a natural disaster. To go against nature, you need to be as strong as it. Michael fell silent, his mind racing. If there were a god in Woodstone City, they would have already stopped this. He also didn't ask why Brian was so calm in the face of catastrophe. Michael had his own guilt and worries to bear. Guilt for not acting sooner and fear for his family. The cracks in the sky stretched so much he could tell they were already dangerously close to the area where his aunt and cousin lived. For a moment, Michael felt paralyzed by the weight of it all. Then Brian's voice broke through his thoughts. You might feel guilty for not acting sooner, but your actions wouldn't have changed much. Even if you'd stopped those two, you'd have only delayed a few cracks or prevented a handful of stronger monsters from appearing. The outcome would still be the same. Brian's eyes narrowed, his tone sharp. If you want to blame someone, blame the Federation. As the two conversed, the streets gradually filled with people. The sight in the sky was impossible to miss. The previously dark streets lit up as residents emerged from their homes, drawn by the ominous spectacle above. Phones were whipped out, their cameras capturing the cracks spreading across the heavens. Michael watched it all unfold, a sinking feeling settling in his chest. He partly understood something then. This city was halfway doomed. Chapter 114 Preparations. When Brian mentioned blaming the Federation, he was specifically referring to their failure to stop and apprehend the culprits before the situation escalated to this point. Being a man of few words, he didn't bother explaining further, leaving Michael to interpret his meaning on his own. On Michael's side, his emotions grew more tangled as he observed the growing crowd on the streets. What frustrated him most was how, despite the evident panic, people seemed more focused on recording the spectacle and posting it online. These people clearly had no grasp of the imminent danger they faced, having been so heavily sheltered by the Federation. Their survival instincts were practically non-existent, worse than those of a chicken, Michael thought grimly. Not long ago, he had been just like them. Only after becoming a supernatural did he finally see a crack with his own eyes. Ironically, despite cracks being such a significant part in history of the world, their dangers were never truly emphasized, not even in textbooks. Monsters were only depicted in textbooks, and even then, the images were neither detailed nor terrifying. They were often presented as simple black and white diagrams, used as mere examples rather than true representations of the horrors they posed. Had these people understood the horrors that lurked behind the cracks, perhaps they'd be rushing to evacuate rather than creating what would likely be their last memories in this world. Michael had his own worries to focus on. His family. Brian's voice came back again and broke through his thoughts. The cracks won't fully open for another 20 minutes or so. That's just enough time to appreciate being alive. Prepare yourself, boy. This will be your first major trial as a warrior of the Federation. Michael noticed the yearning in Brian's voice vanish, replaced by his usual composed tone. And don't worry about those two. I'll handle them. Knowing their type, they'll definitely try something to make the chaos worse. Do your best to survive. You could run, but if you do, you'll be branded a traitor to the Federation, someone who abandoned their responsibilities. Trust me, you won't like the consequences. Brian paused for a moment, then added with a strange finality, "Seems like a new era is about to begin." With that, Brian vanished, leaving Michael to his spiraling thoughts. Shaking off his daze, Michael quickly connected his vision to that of his undead, wanting to see the suspicious duo tied to this madness. However, what he saw was a fading magic circle. There was no sign of the culprits. Teacher Brian must have taken them, Michael realized, and he'd done so effortlessly. Michael stopped bothering about that matter. Without wasting another second, Michael left the alley and reappeared near the duo's last known location. He then swiftly retrieved his undead into his storage space. With nothing else to do at this place, and the looming threat of the cracks breaking in the sky, Michael had only one thing left to do: go to his family. He never thought he'd be rushing home because of something like this. Just as he turned to leave, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Michael felt a flash of impatience, tempted to ignore the call, but in the end he pulled out his phone. The caller ID surprised him. It was his aunt. Michael's hand trembled as he answered immediately. "Aunt Mia." He could hear the desperation in her voice, a tone that pierced his heart. Aunt Mia wasn't just his aunt. She was the only maternal figure he had ever known. After spending more than a decade together, from childhood to now, she was more like a mother. And Lily, her daughter, was a sister figure to him. Their bond had deepened over years of being a family of three. It was obvious his worry about them wasn't one-sided. "Don't worry, Aunt Mia. I'm on my way. Just wait for me," Michael said softly, his voice steady as he tried to calm her down. "Okay, but hurry, okay?" she pleaded. "I will," Michael reassured her before the call ended. Hearing her voice eased his tension and renewed his resolve. Just as he was about to put the phone back in his pocket, another call came in. This time, the name on the screen made his breath hitch. It was another familiar person. Mira. Michael hesitated briefly, his gaze fixed on the cracks in the sky. The ominous red glow around them intensified, slowly painting the heavens crimson. With a deep breath, he answered the call. "Are you seeing this too?" Myra's sharp voice cut straight to the point. "I'm right under it," Michael replied, his tone grim. "Do you know what's going on?" she pressed, though her tone made it clear she wasn't expecting much of an answer. Unexpectedly, she got one. "Yeah, it's demonic cultivators," Michael said bluntly, dropping the bomb without further explanation. "Stay safe. It's about to get messy. We'll talk later if things go well. I need to be with my family." Without waiting for a response, Michael ended the call. At any other time, this would have been considered rude, even disrespectful, but right now, he couldn't care less. With a deep breath and a face devoid of emotion, Michael disappeared from the spot. A while later, knock, knock. "Who's there?" A cautious voice called from behind the door. "It's me, Aunt Mia. It's Michael." He could hear hurried footsteps approaching, and soon the door swung open, revealing Aunt Mia's tired face. Behind her, Lily peeked out, curiosity and worry written all over her young features. "I'm back," Michael said, forcing a smile. On Myra's side, her face twitched as the call with Michael abruptly ended. That guy, she thought bitterly. Her hands clenched at her sides as she resisted the urge to curse out loud. Still, she couldn't ignore what Michael had said before cutting her off. His family. Mira turned to glance at her mother, who was staring out the window, her eyes fixed on the ominous cracks in the sky. Mira couldn't quite put it into words, but ever since her awakening, she had noticed subtle changes in her mother. She seemed to be regaining the cheerfulness she had lost after Myra's father's death, as if awakening had brought hope back into their lives. Mira didn't want that to stop. A determined expression settled on her face as she picked up her phone and dialed a number. The call connected immediately. Lillian, Chapter 115 Thoughts. After talking with Aunt Mia for a while, Michael realized she had sent him a message earlier. Unfortunately, it was around the time he had been busy in the land of origin, so there was no way he could have seen it. He hadn't even bothered to check for any missed calls or messages after returning to the real world, heading straight to the association to sell the corpses he had collected. When Michael finally looked at the message, he saw it was about the money he had sent her. As expected, Aunt Mia had overreacted, or rather, reacted appropriately, to him suddenly transferring such a large amount at once. Checking his call log, Michael saw he also had a couple of missed calls from her before she had decided to send the message instead. Michael felt a twinge of guilt, but there was nothing he could do about the past. It wasn't that he had intentionally ignored her. He had simply been too occupied at the time. The content of the message was exactly what one would expect from a worried guardian. "How did you get the money? Are you safe? Are you in trouble? Call me when you see this. Why did you send so much money?" She had essentially rephrased the same concerns several times. However, unlike what Michael expected, that Aunt Mia would calm down after seeing him and start asking various questions, she didn't. Instead, her first question was about what was going on. In her mind, she didn't expect much of an answer from Michael. After all, he had only been an awakener for barely 5 days. That was hardly enough time to make significant connections or understand the intricacies of supernatural events, let alone something as monumental as this. This was her thought process, which wasn't illogical. Even someone as ordinary as Aunt Mia could tell that the situation with the sky wasn't normal and had to be significant. But despite recognizing this, she wasn't particularly worried. In her mind, she believed the Federation would handle everything. Like most people, she thought the same way. If the sky falls, there's always someone taller to hold it up. And she wasn't entirely wrong. The Federation was strong, more than capable of handling a myriad of crises. However, even a strong man could be caught off guard by a sudden blow. The Federation oversaw the entire Aurora realm. There was bound to be loopholes in their concentration. Michael didn't think the current issue would be too much for the association to handle. But from Brian's words, he knew everything had escalated far too quickly. Still, he held on to the hope that the Federation would be able to resolve the impending doom. It shouldn't take someone strong long to reach here. But the demonic cultivators must know that too. There was no way they would orchestrate something like this and allow the Federation to resolve it so easily. For a group that had managed to fight a behemoth like the Federation for over 2 centuries, they had to have their own means. Even someone as strong as Teacher Brian had spoken with such grave seriousness about the current situation, his words implying that the Federation might not intervene in time. Michael knew he had to prepare himself to face the crisis. But that was his burden to bear. I don't know what's going on, Aunt Mia, but don't move too far from me. The Federation should be able to handle this. Aunt Mia nodded. Michael's response was exactly what she had expected. As for the part about staying close to him, she saw no issue with it. It had been her plan all along. Michael simply reiterating it only reinforced her resolve. Though she doubted Michael had become extraordinarily strong in such a short time, he was still as supernatural, and it made sense to stay by his side. With that, the family gathered in the sitting room. Aunt Mia turned on the television, switching channels to find any news covering the current situation, while Michael stood by the window, observing the sky. The chaotic mixture of energies above hadn't changed much. Michael could now distinguish energy levels comparable to the level 1 crack he had been to, the Goblin World, and others like the level 2 crack he had ventured into, the Ape region. However, these were smaller and closer to the ground compared to the massive cracks in the sky. Judging by the frequency of their chaotic energy, Michael could sense they'd be the first to break, releasing monsters. And it wouldn't take long. Can't I just run away with Aunt Mia and Lily? Michael thought. With my undead, it shouldn't be too hard to escape before the cracks fully break. The thought left a slight bitter taste in his mouth. It felt a little cruel to him to discard everyone else, even as he had the power to help a little. Yet, he couldn't deny he wasn't entirely against the idea. Michael only felt a twinge of guilt, not true remorse for leaving others behind. Another thing the pre-awakening him would feel different about. However, Brian's parting words still lingered in his mind. If he fled, he would be branded a fugitive alongside his family. As much as he wanted to be selfish, his actions would have consequences for his loved ones, and that alone kept him from acting on the thought. That, and the possibility his family wouldn't even agree to leave. Though he'd only recently begun learning the truth about the world, Michael didn't need much time to understand the situation of the humans living in Aurora. Even now, with cracks forming in the sky, people were still out on the streets, laughing, taking photos, and treating the disaster like a spectacle. Michael could already predict the outcome. Chapter 116 Chaos Erupts. The dawn of the Dark Age. It said that on an otherwise ordinary afternoon, cracks of various sizes suddenly appeared in the sky, causing mass panic worldwide. These cracks weren't just anomalies. They became portals from which monsters poured out, wreaking havoc and destruction. Michael knew the historical accounts well, both from school and from foreign discussions. But the current situation felt different. For one, he believed people back then had sharper survival instincts, reacting swiftly to the unknown anomaly. Secondly, according to records, the highest level cracks during the dawn of the Dark Age were only level 2, and even those were rare. It wasn't until much later that stronger cracks began to appear. Now, as Michael assessed the chaotic energy radiating from the sky, he could sense at least 2 level 2 cracks in his vicinity, along with multiple level 1s. He wasn't overly concerned about the level 1 or 2 cracks. He might not be able to protect the entire neighborhood, but he could certainly shield his family. At this point, Michael had stopped feeling guilt about the issue with the suspicious duo earlier. Looking at how it seemed like the entire city was covered in these cracks, there was really nothing he could do except make the final result slightly better. What worried him were the cracks above level 2, the ones farther from the ground. Though Michael's understanding of power levels among awakeners and cultivators was still shaky, he doubted he could handle a level 4 crack on his own. He figured that, with Lucky and Prince by his side, a level 3 might be manageable, but even that wasn't guaranteed. Crack monsters were different from regular monsters. with their overwhelming numbers being their most dangerous trait. Yet, those cracks weren't his primary concern. The Federation and the Association were tasked with handling such large-scale threats. As Michael watched the cracks near the ground turn a deeper red, the people outside finally began to sense the danger and grew visibly uneasy. His thoughts raced. Isn't it said that aside from the initial cracks at the start of the apocalypse, cracks naturally form due to negative energy? But all these cracks were caused by demonic cultivators. Or is it one of those natural disasters triggered by human actions? More pressing was whether he could boost his strength at the last minute. The only viable method was to use his evolution points. Unfortunately, Michael wasn't in a position to leave the original world for the land of origin. Closing his eyes for even a second could result in waking up to a monster inside his apartment. More importantly, leaving would endanger not only his family, but also himself, as his body would remain defenseless while he was in the land of origin, a glaring weakness for awakeners at his level. It was said that this vulnerability diminished at higher ranks, but such knowledge was far beyond Michael's reach. Thankfully, before leaving the land of origin earlier, Michael had summoned all the undead he could dismiss back into the netherworld. Search the Fired at website on Google to access chapters of novels early and in the highest quality. The only ones left behind were either newly revived, unevolved, or unable to be summoned yet. At least this happened after I equipped my undead. That thought gave Michael some solace, though he knew it was the least of his concerns. Still, a part of him was relieved that he wouldn't have to summon a bunch of naked corpses in front of his aunt and cousin. Just as that faintly amusing thought crossed his mind, Michael's phone vibrated. In a daze, he pulled it out and saw a notification. It was a message from the Association. Urgent. Monsters are emerging from cracks in the city. Every supernatural is mandated to protect the public. Non-compliance will result in severe punishment. Repeat. All Federation-affiliated supernaturals in Woodstone City must safeguard the public from immediate threats. Free use of ability in public is permitted. May the will of Aurora live for 1,000,000 years. As Michael finished reading the message, a sudden shout echoed from outside the apartment, drawing his attention and that of his aunt and cousin. Look, something's coming out of that crack. Michael cursed under his breath. The sight of a crack alone should have been enough to keep anyone inside, even without knowing about monster-infested cracks, as one wouldn't know what it looked like until one saw it. A knowledge reserved for supernaturals, basic survival instincts should have kicked in. Michael turned toward the direction of the shout. A couple stood outside, the woman pointing at a specific crack in the sky. Michael followed her gesture, his eyes narrowing. Then he froze. Emerging slowly from the crack were small, green figures. The couple, hindered by the dim light, couldn't make out the details, but Michael could. His sharp eyes caught the unmistakable sight of green hands clawing their way out of the rift. What's that? Michael heard Lily's voice beside him as she tried to squeeze past him for a better view. Michael wasn't about to let that happen. With a firm grip, he pulled her back and spoke in a calm but commanding tone. His cold green eyes sent a chill down Lily's spine, the first time her cousin had ever unsettled her like this. Stay here and don't move. You too, Aunt Mia. His voice was soft yet authoritative, leaving both of them in a daze. They nodded instinctively. Michael turned his attention back outside. By now, it had finally dawned on the crowd that staying outside was a terrible idea, and people began rushing indoors. But it was too late. The full appearance of the green figures came into view as they plummeted from the sky. Some crashed into the ground, breaking limbs and leaving pools of blood. Others landed directly on fleeing civilians, crushing them on impact. The chaos escalated. Some of the green creatures survived with broken limbs. Others were cushioned by their companions, emerging in better shape. It felt as though hell had descended on Aurora. Chapter 117, Going Out to Help. Hell had truly descended. Even for Aunt Mia and Lily, who weren't part of the chaos outside. They had just turned to head toward the sitting room, following Michael's instructions, when a horrifying scene stopped them dead in their tracks. Monsters' blood, they're dead, they're dead. Lily's voice faltered as she stumbled backward, her broken sentences growing shriller with each word. She stepped away from the window in panic, but lost her footing and fell hard to the floor, her cries cutting off abruptly. Shit! Michael cursed under his breath, momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected the damage that would be caused by the creatures emerging from the cracks to be easy to resolve, but what he hadn't foreseen was the sudden appearance and the sheer number that followed. Not only had multiple cracks opened simultaneously, but the monsters poured out rapidly. Level 1 cracks most times had at least 200 from each crack. Even if they emerged 10 at a time, it was overwhelming. In a brief moment of shock, Michael had already seen several people die, their bodies crushed or torn apart before they could even react. He clenched his fists. He couldn't let this continue. Though he found himself growing more detached emotionally, he wasn't completely numb. Watching so many die right in front of him stirred something within, a mix of frustration and anger. But his family came first. Always. Lily lay on the floor, grimacing in pain, her ankle twisted at a slightly odd angle. She'd badly sprained it during her fall. Aunt Mia knelt beside her, trembling but trying to comfort her daughter. Michael, close the window. We need to lock the doors, the windows, everything. Aunt Mia struggled to speak, her voice trembling as if she might burst into tears at any moment. Yet, despite her fear, she clung to a facade of strength. Her body trembled as she tried to pull Michael away from the window to lock it herself. But even if Michael hadn't awakened, moving him would have been a tall order, and now? It was impossible. Michael stood firm, unmoving, his gaze fixed outside. "Why aren't you moving?" she whimpered, her voice cracking. "Those things, they might find us." The dam broke. Aunt Mia's tears streamed down her face, and she began to sob quietly. Lily, lying on the floor, wasn't faring much better. Tears streaked her cheeks, but the pain in her leg and the instinct to stay silent stifled her cries. The horrifying sight of monsters and humans being crushed to death had clearly left a heavy mark on them. Michael's heart ached at the sight of his family in such despair, but he had no time to console them. While Aunt Mia focused on locking up the house, Michael's sharp gaze remained on the chaos outside. Now he could see some people attempting to fight back against the monsters that poured from the cracks. Some of them were ordinary humans or old knight apprentices who had failed to ignite their life seeds, yet had pushed their bodies to the human limit. Others moved with blinding speed, clearly strong supernaturals. But it was a losing battle. The sheer number of monsters far outstripped the handful of defenders, and the chaos only continued to grow. If things were going to improve, Michael knew he had to act. Initially, Michael had only intended to intervene because he couldn't just sit by and watch people die. He wasn't so cold as to ignore the situation entirely. Sending out one of his undead would have also been enough to fulfill the Supernaturals Association's mandatory participation request. But as he watched other supernaturals slaying the monsters, a new thought crossed his mind. Experience points. He hadn't considered this before, too focused on the chaos unfolding. Now, with the chaos fully unleashed, his mind shifted. Even if he didn't care about the people, he could do it for the sake of gaining more experience. In the end, his actions would still save lives. At this moment, thoughts of the Academy were the last thing on Michael's mind. Like many other Awakeners, he was consumed by the pursuit of power, or more like the obsession of leveling up. "Stay here, Aunt Mia. It's not safe outside," Michael said firmly. "Lock everything, like you just mentioned, and don't let anyone in, no matter who they are." Mia opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat as Michael stretched out his hand. A large figure clad in black armor, wielding an oversized hammer, materialized before her, its imposing form nearly touching the ceiling. Though its face was hidden, the sheer presence of the figure felt like a beast staring her down. Mia stood frozen, her mind a flurry of questions. What was happening outside was terrifying enough, but now she wanted answers about the strange, witchcraft-like magic circle that had appeared in her home, summoning this monstrous figure. Beginning, Michael commanded the undead. "Protect her and her. Remember, protect them both. Nothing, absolutely nothing, must happen to them." He kept the instructions simple. Terms like aunt or cousin might complicate the command, so he avoided them altogether. Satisfied, Michael turned back and drew a weapon he hadn't touched since his awakening, one of his first purchases. A dagger. When Michael first awakened, the initial weapons he bought before entering the land of origin were 3. A gun, a spear, and a dagger. Of the 3, only the dagger remained relatively unused. Occasionally, in moments of idle thought, Michael had considered selling or discarding it. But now, here it was about to be handed to his aunt. It was one of the worst weapons for supernaturals, but for an ordinary person, it was far better than a kitchen knife. "Aunt Mia, please take this," Michael said, pressing the dagger into her hand. "You probably won't need it with my undead here, but just in case. I'll be back soon. Don't leave unless absolutely necessary." He didn't give her a chance to refuse, placing the weapon firmly in her grasp before turning to Lily, who had stopped crying. Her gaze shifted between Beginning's massive form and her injured leg, a mix of surprise and pain etched on her face. "Be careful, okay?" Michael said softly, crouching beside her. "Don't move too much because of your leg. Listen to Aunt Mia and stay close to this big guy. He'll keep you both safe." "Michael," Aunt Mia began, but before she could finish, Michael had already leaped out of the window. Chapter 118, First Wave. There was no dramatic, ground-shattering landing. How could there be when Michael had only jumped from his second-floor apartment? If it had been a skyscraper, perhaps such theatrics would have been justified. A cracked ground would have signaled that Michael had put too much force into the landing, an overzealous use of strength or pure vanity. But in a situation where a massacre was unfolding, who was there to impress? Monsters? The dying? Corpses? Michael didn't want to waste even a moment. The instant his feet hit the ground, he summoned his weapon from the storage space. In a fluid motion, effortlessly decapitated 3 green-skinned creatures charging toward him. The green figures weren't unfamiliar to Michael. Hobgoblins and goblins, with the latter appearing in greater numbers. The goblins he had hunted himself in the level 1 crack, the goblin world, and brought from the association from the real world. The hobgoblins, however, were creatures he hadn't seen in the real world or in the land of origin. But thanks to the evolution of his talent, he had been able to evolve his 1-star undead goblin to 3-star common rank hobgoblin, making him quite familiar with them. Their presence only confirmed his earlier theory. There existed an evolutionary path for the monsters in nature. Unfortunately, the monsters now were all high-leveled. Hobgoblin LV11. Rank common. Goblin LV6. Rank common. Goblin LV5. Rank common. For weaker supernaturals, these creatures would be deadly. But to Michael, they were nothing more than experience points that were waiting to be harvested by his spear. Venomfang Spear. Rank rare. Type, Poison Spear. Inflicts a potent poison on the target, dealing continuous damage over time and weakening their defenses. The spear's razor-sharp edge was as deadly as its venomous bite. Michael wasn't planning to idly stand by while these experience points, monsters, continued their rampage. Drawing on his mana reserves, he activated his summoning skill. Greenish-black circles appeared around him, and moments later, towering figures emerged from the void. Michael could summon a total of 12 undead from the netherworld. 3 wolves, 1 ape, and 8 orcs. With beginning, the first goblin he had evolved, guarding his family, Michael called forth 9 more. His summoned army consisted of a verdant wolf, 5 male orcs, 3 female orcs, and a blue-furred ape. Each one of them was a 1-star rare ranked creature, their power rivaling that of a peak elite cultivator, rank 2, at least. Michael didn't summon Lucky or Prince for now. Without hesitation, Michael issued a cold, unwavering command. Kill every monster in sight. The moment his voice echoed, his undead army, along with Michael as the lead, vanished into the chaos. It didn't take long for the people in the surrounding area to notice the sudden shift in the battlefield. After all, how could they not? 10 humanoid figures, each radiating immense power, tore through the hordes with ruthless efficiency, relentlessly killing everything that came in their path. Michael's spear had become an extension of his will, its venom claiming one goblin life after the other. In fact, he had lost count of how many times he had swung his spear, yet despite his relentless effort, the decrease in monsters he had anticipated never came. The good thing was that thanks to his efforts, his undead, and the other supernaturals in the area, they had managed to immediately stop the carnage, even allowing some ordinary citizens to seek shelter in the still-standing buildings nearby. However, even those buildings weren't entirely safe. From time to time, agonizing screams echoed from within, piercing the air. Not all the level 1 cracks that unleashed monsters appeared directly above ground. Some had erupted on rooftops. The monsters emerging from those cracks were at an advantage, as they didn't fall far. They could find multiple ways to infiltrate the buildings, and when faced with even weak monsters like goblins, ordinary people didn't stand chance. Fortunately, Michael didn't have to worry about his family. By frequently circling the vicinity of his apartment building and checking his connection with Beginning, he was reassured that his family remained safe and there were no breaches around them. His aunt, though naturally kind-hearted, understood the severity of the situation and refrained from causing unnecessary trouble. And although Michael hadn't noticed any sign of monsters breaking into his apartment building since no screams had erupted so far, he didn't want to take any chances. He stationed 1 undead to actively patrol and clear the area around the building while another stood guard for potential emergencies. He also hadn't forgotten Brian's warning about the possibility of demonic supernaturals sowing more chaos. But after remaining vigilant for so long and finding no signs of their presence, Michael concluded 2 possibilities. They were either hiding and biding their time, or they were targeting more significant locations than the old estate, where Michael lived. Minutes passed as Michael mulled over his thoughts, issued commands to his undead, and continued to fight the monsters raining from the crack tirelessly. Eventually, the immediate area was cleared. However, no one celebrated. Corpses, both human and monster, were strewn across the ground, painting a grim scene of devastation. It resembled the aftermath of an apocalypse. Among the supernaturals, only a handful now remained standing, and even then, just barely. The ones who had reacted to the chaos appeared far older than Michael, a clear sign they had awakened their powers much later in their lives. The only thing distinguishing them from ordinary citizens was the life seed embedded within. But what truly gripped the crowd with dread was the sight above. The cracks in the sky had thinned, but their ominous presence remained. There were fewer of them now, not because they were closing, but because their density had dispersed, revealing a sprawling, interconnected network. Will the next cracks to break be level 2s? Michael muttered, his expression souring at the thought. He wasn't worried about the monsters themselves. Against those from level 1 cracks, he hadn't even bothered using his skills, just his raw physical stats and spear. He doubted much would change with the next wave. At most, his killing speed might slow down slightly. But what truly concerned him was the sheer volume of monsters and the escalating pattern of the cracks. The first wave had unleashed level 1 cracks. If the second wave were to bring level 2 monsters, what would follow? Level 3s? Level 4s? Michael doubted he was overthinking. Some cracks that were high in the sky and distant from his immediate vicinity radiated with a chilling, oppressive aura. Even now, they sent chills down his spine. Yet, amidst the growing dread, Michael couldn't ignore a part of himself that was relishing this unfolding chaos, a realization that left him feeling a pang of guilt. Status: Name: Michael Norman. Class: Adept Necromancer. Level: 15. EXP: 16, 644/17, 718. Michael felt conflicted, but knowing that he was just minutes away from leveling up made him wonder what kind of heaven and hell he had stumbled into. Chapter 119: Supernatural versus Ordinary. Heaven and hell. It seemed the perfect way to describe the scene around him. The once peaceful estate he had known for years was now drenched in blood. The fleeting sense of satisfaction Michael felt instantly vanished the moment his gaze swept over the carnage. Aunt Mia stood there, peeking through the window. Her body trembled, but she forced herself to watch, not the carnage, but at him. Michael frowned. He hated what Aunt Mia was doing to herself. This was nothing short of mental torture. Yet, there were things he couldn't control, her freedom to be one of them. Strangely, while the bloody massacre before him was horrific, it stirred little more than mild discomfort. Perhaps it was because he had spent the past few days knee-deep in corpses, battling monsters and narrowly escaping death. This kind of horror barely fazed him anymore. What he did feel, however, was anger. It wasn't a righteous fury or some heroic urge to save the world. This was personal. It was about his family. Michael had inherited this body's feelings and memories. While he still recalled his past life on Earth, those memories felt distant, like fragments of a dream. This world, though more perilous, had given him something his old life never did: a healthy body and extraordinary power. He had an incredible undead army and a unique talent. Even if someday most of it was stripped away, the healthy body alone was enough for Michael to embrace this new life fully. And now, a group of lunatics called demonic supernaturals wanted to ruin that. Michael's anger ignited, burning hot and fierce. What would have happened if he hadn't awakened? This plan had clearly been in motion far longer than Miachel could fathom, its reach engulfing an entire city like Woodstone. Without his powers, his family, and he himself would have perished. To some degree, Michael could understand the mindset of the demonic supernaturals. Growth often reshapes perspective. The rich cannot truly understand the struggles of the poor, just as the poor can't comprehend the life of the rich. Mortals can't fathom the thoughts of gods. But understanding did not mean forgiveness. If one aspired to live like a king, or at least experience a life different from the constraints of an ordinary life, then the battle should be against those in power, not those who didn't have any of it. In Michael's opinion, doing the opposite of this felt both flawed and twisted. As a human, he understood what he was capable of thinking. If he, one day, as a rank 4 awakener, were ever forced to stand in a long queue with ordinary humans and be treated the same, he knew he'd lose his mind. Though he didn't think this was likely to happen in real life, considering how supernaturals had little societal influence despite their overwhelming power, who knew if something like this had happened before or not? Perhaps, at some point in his 18 years in this realm, someone with godlike abilities had been forced to behave like an ordinary human, waiting in line like everyone else alongside him. Michael could understand where the bitterness stemmed from, but that didn't excuse poor behavior. Thank you so much for your help. Michael, who was still lost in thought as he stared at the red, gloomy sky with a frown, was pulled back to reality by a voice. He turned his head and saw an elderly man standing beside him. Though the man's face seemed vaguely familiar, Michael didn't know him personally. It's no problem. This is what I should be doing, Michael replied politely. The old man opened his mouth to speak more, but a sudden scream cut through the air, interrupting him. Following the scream, 2 hands grabbed Michael's shirt. You killed my father. You killed my father. A young man, roughly Michael's age, stood before him. His hair was dyed in 3 colors and tattoos covered his face. Though Michael wasn't one to judge by appearances, it was clear what kind of person was clutching his shirt now. Unfortunately, not only did Michael not know this person, but he also couldn't understand the sudden hostility. Worse still, his patience was already running thin. He had just slain over 200 monsters, his bloodlust was still simmering, and the thrill of battle was pulsing in his veins. It was a miracle he hadn't slapped the man outright. "Get your hands off me." Michael's voice was calm, but it carried a chill that sent shivers down everyone's spine who heard it. Even the surviving, ordinary people, mourning over their lost loved ones or their own injuries, fell silent and stared at him. Despite the warning, the young man didn't let go. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he glared at Michael with defiance. "Oh, and what will you do? Do you think that just because you have some fancy powers, you can do whatever you want?" The youth spat, jealousy and rage flashing in his eyes. Michael's gaze turned icy. He debated whether to handle this lightly or use some force. But before he could decide how to act, a fist flew from nowhere, slamming the young man square in the face. The blow sent the youth flying 5 meters away, leaving the crowd stunned. The one who delivered the punch was someone Michael recognized, his neighbor from the apartment building. The man was one of the strongest supernaturals who had fought alongside him during the chaos. Rats these days, they don't know their limits, or when to show gratitude, the man muttered, turning to Michael, who watched him curiously. "My apologies for my nephew's behavior," the man said with a sigh. "He's just grieving my brother's death." Some people, blinded by their upbringing, believe everyone is equal. They simply refuse to accept the truth of the world. Chapter 1:20 Preparations. The man's words carried a terrace of double meaning. It made sense. Only a supernatural could truly understand another supernatural. Michael's neighbor, who happened to be a peak mid-stage knight, seemed to embody this notion. But what surprised Michael more was how casually the man had spoken about his brother's death. For a moment, his words made Michael suspect the two might have had a strained relationship, perhaps even worse. Maybe the man had left his brother to die, unwilling to save him from the claws of the monsters. Though Michael's expression remained neutral, his wariness grew. He was already considering adding this neighbor to his blacklist when the man continued speaking. "I'm sorry for my nephew's rude behavior. The death of my brother must have been too much for him to handle." The man's voice faltered, choking on the words, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Michael's sharp eyes noticed the man's clenched fists, trembling slightly, as though he was restraining himself. "He's pretending to be strong," Michael thought. A faint trace of respect flickered within him. "What happened to him?" Michael asked, glancing around the area. The monsters were gone, and his undead stood motionless, their commands fulfilled. Well, most of them anyway. Lily and another female orc with water-manipulating abilities were fussing over a third female orc who shared Lily's fire affinity. The third female orc, however, seemed more intent on scrubbing the blood off herself than paying attention to them. A clean freak orc? Michael mused, intrigued. The intelligence and unique quirks of his rare-rank creatures never ceased to fascinate him. Lucky, the gluttonous wolf with boundless potential, was a stark contrast to Prince, whose calm and responsible demeanor made him seem like the true elder brother of the army. They feel so alive despite being undead. Michael's thoughts were interrupted by the trembling voice of the youth from earlier. Blood dripped from the boy's mouth as he spat bitterly. "You have so much power. My father didn't die immediately when the monsters appeared. We were holding on until a stronger one came. But where were you? You were busy killing monsters that hadn't even attacked anyone yet." Michael's eyes narrowed as realization dawned. So that's what this is about. If there was something Michael could acknowledge was wrong about him, it was that he was too understanding. The fact that he could reason with even a sliver of the demonic supernatural's mindset was proof of this, despite how evil their actions were. But accusing others rudely was outright wrong, especially if you were the one on the receiving end of such disrespect. Michael wasn't going to lie. He was quite concerned about gaining experience points. Even so, the first monsters he cleared were the ones that were closest to people and would pose an immediate threat to them before going after others to gain points. There was no way he would let someone get killed when he had the power to stop it. No matter how tempting experience points were, those wouldn't make him flinch in such a situation. Yet, here he was, not only Michael accused, but disrespected to his face by someone who had just witnessed his capabilities. It seemed that in this world, only the adults possessed a proper sense of reality, sensibility, and survival instincts. At least, neither Michael, from Earth, nor the original soul inhabiting this body would dare to grip someone's shirt after seeing them move at blurring speed. This scene made Michael remember a certain phrase he had often encountered as a novelist back on Earth. The phrase that would sometimes leave him cringing if used too many times in one sitting. And yet, in the current situation, the saying seemed to fit perfectly. This guy was courting death. The rude youth's body trembled as he stood and approached Michael, his voice laced with self-righteousness. I know all supernaturals are required to register with the Supers Association and protect the citizens. With your power, you're obviously someone who should carry the most responsibility, but you're nothing more than useless. If it was my uncle. Michael had no patience for the nonsense anymore. Without a word, he immediately cast a skill on him. Slow Curse. Though the skill was at basic mastery and offered limited effects on an evenly matched opponent, against an ordinary human, it was devastating. Suddenly, the youth felt his movements turning slow. No, they didn't just slow, they halted completely. Looking into Michael's cold, expressionless eyes, dread filled his heart. The weight of Michael's overwhelming bloodlust washed over him, paralyzing the youth. I'm going to die, he thought, terror clutching his heart. Fortunately for him, Michael had no intention of killing him. Yes, I'm a member of the Supers Association, and yes, I'm tasked with protecting the public. But understand this, you're not entitled to my help simply because the association has imposed this role on me. Be careful, I'm not as patient or forgiving as you might hope. Michael's true feelings surfaced at that moment. He despised how his growing strength as a supernatural was forcing him to understand some of the twisted words spoken by the seniors on the forum, and even the warped ideologies of demonic supernaturals. The Federation. It was nothing short of a tyrant. He was expected to risk everything, his life and the lives of his loved ones, putting himself in danger with no apparent reward, all for the Federation's cause. And if he refused, he would be branded a criminal, all because their power spanned across the entire realm, leaving no room for dissent. Michael didn't know much about the Federation, which seemed to regard itself as a kingdom with supernaturals as its subjects. But from what he had seen so far, his impression of it was far from favorable. Of course, this didn't mean Michael planned to go rogue. Doing so would bring him no benefits and would in fact cause more trouble. As tyrannical as the Federation was, it still offered advantages like the resources and protections he couldn't afford to ignore. This, and he also didn't dare to. Releasing the curse, Michael watched as the rude youth nearly collapsed face first to the ground, but his uncle caught him just in time. Michael spoke, his voice like ice as he delivered his final words. Be careful who you speak to, especially people like me. You never know when someone might have the patience of a dog. None at all. Surprisingly, Michael's neighbor didn't react to his use of power on the nephew. Instead, the man acted as though it were normal, helping the boy up before addressing Michael. Thank you for going easy on him, the man said with a smile that carried a deeper meaning. Michael felt a twinge of guilt. The man had just lost his brother, and now his nephew had been suppressed right in front of him, though the boy's rudeness had warranted it. As for whether this would bring trouble later, Michael didn't dwell on it. At most, the youth might try to stir up trouble, claiming Michael had abused his authority. If the Supers Association made an issue of it after everything he'd done to protect the public, it would only worsen his opinion of the Federation. Michael merely nodded at the man, ignoring the entitled nephew who, like so many other citizens, was blinded by a false sense of equality. Turning to the crowd, Michael raised his voice. If you want to die, stay out here. More creatures will be coming through those cracks at any moment. The moment his words landed, the spectators, who had been in awe of Michael's earlier display of power when he conjured a magic circle with a mere hand gesture, snapped back to reality. Panic set in. Some rushed to more secure buildings, while others moved about indecisively. The most fearful were the seriously injured. Michael watched all of this. Initially, Michael didn't plan to get too involved, but knowing his aunt's eyes were likely on him now, he stepped up to take charge. Despite being one of the youngest present, Michael was undoubtedly the most powerful. After his recent show of strength, no one dared oppose him. However, his clear grasp of the situation soon earned him genuine respect. Aware that the next wave of monsters was only minutes away, Michael moved quickly to organize the crowd. He had his verdant wolf-constructed dome-like shelter using thick, sturdy vines, directing people to take refuge inside. Compared to the fragile structures of the buildings around him, Michael trusted the durability of the vine dome far more. He also instructed the verdant wolf to wrap his apartment building in layers of vines, turning it into an armored fortress. To ensure safety, Michael deployed his undead to accompany the teams spreading the message. He gave them specific instructions to handle any lurking monsters that might have been missed during the earlier skirmish. While some of the supernaturals assisting him could handle a few stray creatures, an overwhelming number could lead to unnecessary casualties, something Michael wanted to prevent. Chapter 121, Second Wave. Those your people, who are they? The elderly man, who was the first person to speak with Michael after the initial wave, asked cautiously, each word carefully chosen. Michael found the effort mildly amusing, but couldn't also help feel a growing respect for the old man. Though Michael didn't know how cultivators aged, he suspected that this man was far older than he looked, and he already appeared ancient. "They're my people," Michael replied after a pause. He'd initially considered saying undead, but the term felt too loaded, especially for ordinary people whose first encounter with the supernatural might have been this very event. Michael wouldn't assume that the man's status as a knight meant he was well versed in the intricacies of the supernatural world. If it had been just as undead wolves and the blue ape, Michael wouldn't have hesitated, to be honest. But the orcs complicated things. The female orcs, unarmored unlike their male counterparts, had humanoid appearance and could almost pass for human aside from their greenish-gray skin and unusual hair. The male orcs, clad in heavy armor, looked imposing but not monstrous. Calling them undead might lead people to assume he had killed humans to raise them, a conclusion that wasn't hard for one to jump upon. The human mind was remarkable in its ability to twist facts to fit a narrative. Michael recalled how one of his friends back on Earth had broken up with his girlfriend over a misunderstanding. She accused him of cheating simply because he hadn't replied to her messages one night. The truth? He had fallen asleep. Though everyone knew the truth, the argument she presented made her perspective seem almost logical. They eventually reconciled and even married, but the incident left a lasting impression on Michael. Later, it came to light that she'd been tired of his friend's almost nonchalant attitude and wanted to test if he cared enough to fight for her. Women. Well, both sides had been toxic in their own rights. Michael saw that the old man was about to speak again, but knowing there wasn't much time left, he cut him off. "Those monsters will be coming here any minute now. Please get inside." The old man hesitated for a moment, his wary gaze fixed on the sky before he finally nodded and retreated into one of the vine-domed shelters Michael's undead had constructed. Inside the makeshift sanctuary, fear was palpable among the cramped and anxious survivors. To Michael's surprise, a significant portion of the community, 48 people, had chosen to place their trust in him. Despite the chaos and bloodshed, 48 people had opted to stay within the protective range of his undead. This was in stark contrast to the remaining survivors, who either stayed barricaded in their homes, convinced that they were safer there, or had other reasons that Michael didn't care to ponder. As expected, the supernaturals who had helped earlier had wisely decided to sit out the next round. Their senses, though less refined than Michael's, were still sharp enough to feel the rising tension in the air. The chaotic energy in the sky didn't need to announce itself for them to realize that what had nearly killed them earlier had merely been a prelude. In the end, Michael stood alone with his undead, surrounded by a community that was now a battlefield littered with blood, corpses, both human and monster, and the frightened whispers of those hoping for salvation. "It's going to break any minute now," Michael muttered, his sharp gaze locked on the cracks spreading through the sky. "Though I doubt the second wave will be anything but overwhelmingly strong, I can't afford to let my guard down. Monsters are flooding the city, and I doubt most areas have anyone capable enough to deal with them." The thought sent a shiver down his spine, conjuring grim images of the devastation outside the community gates. Perhaps beyond these community walls lay the true apocalypse. Taking a look around, Michael surveyed his surroundings for one last time. The Vine Dome stood firm, each sheltering at least 15 people. His apartment building, now sealed off completely, housed his family, guarded vigilantly by his undead. As for those still hiding in their homes, Michael was also prepared to protect them if possible. But if he couldn't, well, there wasn't much he could do. At least now, with fewer people in the open, he could fight with complete focus. "This chaos should be enough to help me level up a few times, right?" Michael thought, a glimmer of excitement crossing his eyes. He didn't even have time to open his status panel before the first round of monsters descended. Unlike before, these creatures didn't crash to their deaths or easily wound themselves upon impact. They were also unfamiliar to Michael, but all of them appear to be of the same type. Rock Scorpion LV-12. Rank Common. Rock Scorpion LV-14. Rank Common. The Rock Scorpions were all Rank 1 creatures, typically requiring the power of a Rank 2 cultivator to handle. Experience more tails on Empire. However, that was for cultivators. For Michael and his undead, these scorpions, despite their size, were little more than oversized targets. One of the male orcs wielding a Titan Wrath Hammer launched the first attack, striking as soon as the monsters appeared. The hammer shockwave effect bypassed the scorpion's thick exoskeleton, shattering its defense and killing it instantly. While the orc could have achieved a similar outcome with its strength alone, the hammer had significantly enhanced the damage. More notifications of monsters falling at the hands of his undead flashed before Michael's eyes, but he ignored them and instead chose to join the action himself. Though the scorpion's rocky defenses were formidable against regular supernaturals, they were no match for Michael. With the spear in hand, he fought precisely, dealing damage just as effectively as his undead, slicing through the monsters with deadly accuracy and reducing them to pieces. A few more, And I'll be able to level up, Michael muttered under his breath, his eyes scanning for his next target. While Michael fought for experience points and ensured the safety of the people in his community, the rest of the city was engulfed in its own battles. Chapter 122, Checking Themselves. Just as Michael had suspected, the entire city was embroiled in battle. It wasn't just the cracks spilling monsters that spread havoc. Demonic supernaturals were also at work, though they avoided smaller places like Michael's community. Small numbers and a lack of strategic value made such areas unworthy of their attention. The truth was, if the Supers Association were the city's only line of defense against the cracks appearing in the sky, the city would have still survived, albeit at the cost of significant damage and heavy casualties. The association branches weren't weak. Each branch had its own share of powerful individuals capable of handling level 1 to level 3 dimensional cracks. Under normal circumstances, the first rounds of chaos could have been mitigated, and order would have been restored before things escalated further. Unfortunately, the demonic supernaturals were well aware of this and had no intention of making things that easy. They had the weaker cultivators blend in with the monsters to attack ordinary citizens and supernaturals affiliated with the Supers Association. Meanwhile, their stronger cultivators maintained a barrier cast over the entire Woodstone City, preventing anyone from entering or leaving except themselves. The barrier not only sealed the city, but also blocked communication and was heavily guarded by powerful demonic cultivators to prevent the Supers Association from destroying it and communicating with the outside world. The whole city was trapped in a prison. Don't move, Brian. Our job here is just to check each other. If you move, I move, a man floating mid-air said with a faint smirk. His ability to hover in the air marked him as a rank 4 cultivator at least, a level just below the revered king rank. However, this man wasn't simply a rank 4 cultivator. He was a genuine king rank expert, a rank 5 cultivator comparable to a rank 3 awakener. On the surface, that is. Though the two power systems were distinct, when standing at king's rank, a cultivator became untouchable for most awakeners below rank 3. At king's rank, cultivators could transcend realms without the aid of dimensional portals and even tap into the laws of the world, a feat that set them apart as true forces of nature. If I were at king rank now, a monkey like you wouldn't have even dared to speak to me. You trash, the other man sneered, his voice laced with icy disdain. The speaker was Brian, a member of the Supers Association Michael was familiar with. Had Michael been there, he would have recognized the cold fury in Brian's eyes, a sharp contrast to his usually calm demeanor. But you're not king rank, Brian. I am, the floating man retorted with an air of superiority. Brian's lips curled into a sharp grin as his words cut through the man's arrogance. Then fight me, if you dare, Peter. The hovering man, who was now recognized as Peter, said nothing. His smug expression faltered, replaced by a cautious frown. In the night cultivation system, the first step in the journey was to awaken a life seed, which marked the beginning of a mortal's evolution into something greater. A peak rank 1 cultivator could comfortably live for 100 years. A rank 2 knight, who had evolved their life seed once, could live for 150 years. At this stage, they could infuse mana into their body and manipulate it to perform battle arts. Enjoy new tales from Empire. A rank 3 knight, with their life seed evolved twice, could live for 200 years. At this point, the mana contained within their life seed could be externalized and used to cast spells. While this was still inferior to traditional mages, it was a significant improvement in their abilities. A rank 4 knight, having evolved their life seed thrice, reached the peak of their supernatural organs potential and could live for 300 years. They gained the ability to fly and could detonate their life seed temporarily to gain a terrifying boost in overall prowess. Beyond this, cultivation became exponentially challenging. A knight would need cultivation experience, a suitable cultivation method, talent, and comprehension to transform their life seed into a law seed. The strength of the comprehended law determined their power upon advancing to the king level, but also the difficulty of their breakthrough. He had been stuck at this stage for 50 years, a time marked by betrayal. 50 years ago, the man standing before him, someone Brian once called a friend, betrayed him and the Federation, advancing to rank 5 while Brian remained stagnant. What's the matter? Don't dare to attack, Brian taunted, his voice sharp, almost mocking. If Michael had been here to witness this, he would have been shocked beyond belief. Was this the same man who once seemed indifferent, as though even the end of the world wouldn't faze him, behaving like this? Peter's frown deepened, but he remained still, making no move. Though on the surface he was stronger than Brian, he knew, after 50 long years, that appearances could be deceiving. The law of eternal embers. That was Brian's law, the foundation of his fearsome power. From the countless battles they had fought in the past, Peter had come to understand a few critical things about it. This law was devastatingly powerful, The law of eternal embers was a profound and destructive fire-based law rooted in the principles of perpetual burning and undying flames. Unlike ordinary fire laws, it did not focus solely on raw destructive power, but embodied the concept of persistence and regeneration through fire, making it a force of perpetual burning and undying flames, both creative and destructive. The flames conjured by this law never extinguished naturally. Only the cultivator himself, or a higher-tier law, could snuff them out. These flames devoured not only physical objects, but also pure energy, consuming everything it touched and leaving nothing but ash in their wake. Worse still, Brian's techniques grew stronger the longer they were sustained. His flames became hotter, fiercer, and more destructive over time. It was a terrifying law, one that elevated him to the strength of an ordinary rank 5 cultivator, despite being stuck at half-step king level. But it came at a price. The sheer power of the law was too much for Brian's body to contain, which explained why he looked older than he should. It had drained his lifespan, which would usually be far longer at his stage, and was eroded by the relentless toll of his law. Still, Peter knew one thing. If he didn't attack first, Brian wouldn't either. Brian was undeniably strong. Peter couldn't deny that, but not strong enough to hold him back if he was dead set on not fighting him. If he decided to destroy the city, nothing would be able to stop him. It was this certainty that had kept Peter confident for years, keeping the Mad Phoenix at bay. At least, that was what Peter believed, until he heard Brian's next words. Chapter 123 Old History. There are 2 ways to advance to rank 5. Brian, who had been aggressive just moments ago, suddenly calmed down and spoke softly. His demeanor shifted into one Michael knew all too well. An eerie calmness. In the outermost reaches of the void, high above Woodstone, Brian hovered alongside Peter, his gaze fixed on the city below. Technically, Brian was still a rank 4 cultivator, and the barrier surrounding the city should have been enough to keep him out. Yet it failed to do so, not against someone with his level of power. Peter's frown deepened. He had no idea what Brian was getting to, but a sense of unease began to creep into his thoughts. To be honest, he'd rather face anyone else than this bastard. Unfortunately, by the time he realized the Mad Phoenix was here to guard against them, after the Federation had caught wind of their traces, it was far too late to change course. This operation was far too important to let his personal grievances interfere. Woodstone wasn't the only city under attack. Many others were already falling to their plan. This assault wasn't a spur-of-the-moment assault. It was the culmination of months of planning and coordination. Their objective was simple: reassert their group's prominence, recruit new members, and remind the world of an undeniable truth. Supernaturals and ordinary mortals were not equals. They were kings. And as always, fear was their chosen weapon, the oldest trick in the book. The first way is to create your own law, and it can be shaped using the blueprint of others. This is the traditional path, the most stable one, Brian explained, his voice steady. But do you know what happens when you extract it from someone who's still alive? They die. Yes, they die. And I'm sure someone like you knows this all too well, considering it's exactly how you advanced. Peter's frown deepened as the weight of forgotten guilt stirred within him. Half a century ago, he and Brian were both hailed as 2 of the Federation's top geniuses, a reputation that masked the truth beneath. Peter had fought tooth and nail just to remain second to Brian. He had done everything in his power, cultivated relentlessly, and pushed himself to the limits in desperation to keep up. Yet, despite all his efforts, he barely managed to stay in the race. The only reason he could hold on was Brian's habit of diverting his focus to other pursuits. While this broadened Brian's overall strength, it also slowed his cultivation. And yet, despite all his efforts, Peter could never surpass him. But it wasn't Brian who drove him to the edge of despair. It was Brian's daughter, Isabella. She was the child of Brian and the woman Peter had loved, the woman who, in his eyes, had chosen someone better. If Peter and Brian were considered Federation geniuses, Isabella was in a league of her own. She was one of the rare holy children the realm could produce, a being with the potential of a god. Her talent was so overwhelming that it overshadowed the painful truth of her birth, that her existence had cost her mother's life. As much as Peter despised her, he couldn't deny the sheer enormity of her talent. She was a monster. At only 14 years old, Isabella had reached the half-step king rank, a feat achieved in just 4 years of cultivation. If Brian's talent had been a source of jealousy for Peter, Isabella's existence filled him with dread. She was a walking nightmare for him. He was consumed by envy and resentment. He admitted he shouldn't have felt this way, but the thought of a child, a 14-year-old born of his rival and the sacrifice of the woman he loved, soon surpassing him in cultivation, made it unbearable. It was also around this time that Brian had begun approaching the comprehension of his law. So Peter acted. He killed her. On the day Isabella was advancing, The demonic supernaturals attacked Brian's residence to disrupt her breakthrough. That was when Peter made his move. As one of the Federation's most prominent geniuses, the Federation had spared no effort in protecting Isabella during this critical moment. They fortified Brian's residence and deployed elite forces to defend against the demonic supernaturals. Yet, no one had expected the betrayal to come from within, and certainly not from Peter, someone who could almost be considered Isabella's half-father. To this day, Peter still dreamt of a look of disbelief on Isabella's face as his hand pierced her chest. Uncle Peter, he could still hear her voice, soft and trembling, echoing in his mind, her last words before he detonated her body into nothingness. The only trace of her existence was the lost seed he had taken, her lost seed, a law she had comprehended but never had the chance to wield. The law of wailing shadows. It was a necromantic law, rooted in the remnants of death, fear, and sorrow. For a child he had always imagined to have lived like a princess in a fairy tale, for her to understand such darkness revealed that she, too, had a story, one no one would ever truly know. Unlike traditional necromantic powers that commanded legions of undead, this law thrived on subtlety and psychological manipulation. It turned the lingering energies of death into shadowy specters, intangible and insidious. These specters, born from the sorrow and regret of the dead, were harder to damage and devastating in mental warfare. It was a powerful law, one Peter had no right to wield with his original talent. Yet it was his now. What puzzled Peter, however, was Brian's reaction in the years since. While Brian clearly despised and hated him, often hurling insults or outright attacking him when they crossed paths, he avoided speaking directly about Isabella. He had remained silent about the betrayal that had claimed his daughter's life. Until today. For some reason, Brian had chosen to confront him now. Brian's voice broke the silence. Do you know, Peter, I initially didn't care about whatever you demonic supernaturals were up to. Even when I heard you were planning something big, it didn't matter to me. But then I heard traces of you being found in this little city. Peter's expression darkened, but he said nothing, continuing to listen as he wondered what his old friend was planning, all while staying alert to his surroundings. So, I thought, why not pay my friend a visit like always? But I couldn't come empty-handed, could I? An unsettling unease crept into his heart. The moment Peter heard this, he understood why he had been feeling uneasy. It was clear that Brian was setting him up for something. Without hesitation, he tried to flee, but just as he attempted to leave the void and enter the outside world, he felt a barrier stop him, as though he had hit an invisible wall. What have you done? Peter's voice turned sharp with anger, his eyes turning pitch black, and black mist began to emanate from his body. On the other side, Brian now appeared like a human figure wrapped in blue flames, exuding an overwhelming presence. With an air of majesty and grace, he slowly raised an object the size of a tennis ball in his hand. It looked like an unremarkable stone symbol, but Peter recognized it instantly. The Voidlock's sigil. Bastard! How do you have his treasure? Peter's eyes widened. A wild smile slowly spread across Brian's lips, yet his voice remained soft. It's simple. The only value of a man who has lost everything is himself. And what does such a value mean to me when the one who took everything from me lives? He answered his own question. Nothing. Chapter 124, Final Battle. Peter's heart sank as he glanced around. The space they floated in seemed unchanged, yet there was an undeniable shift in the air. The void, once vast and boundless, now felt constricted. Do you really think your little tricks can hold me? Peter sneered, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The black mist around him surged, forming spectral figures that hissed and wailed, their cries echoing in the enclosed void. Brian chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. Hold you? Oh, Peter, you misunderstand. This isn't a prison for you. His eyes burned with an intensity that made Peter flinch. This is your grave. The temperature plummeted as Brian's aura exploded outward, the void trembling under the weight of his power. Flames, bright and unyielding, erupted around him, painting the dark expanse in hues of sky blue and deep blue. The embers danced with an eerie grace, their heat palpable even in the void. Peter's eyes widened. He can't be serious. You can't sustain the eternal embers for long. Peter snapped, though his voice wavered. It'll kill you. Brian shrugged, his flames growing brighter. Perhaps, but what makes you think I'll be the only one dying here? Peter's mind raced. He had known Brian to be reckless, but this was madness. It really did fit his name, Mad Phoenix. You're willing to throw your life away for revenge? Brian's expression darkened, and for the first time, Peter saw the raw pain hidden beneath the calm facade. This isn't just revenge, Peter. This is justice for Isabella. The wailing shadows surged forward, but the eternal embers roared in response, consuming them before they could reach their target. The two forces clashed violently, the void trembling under the strain of their battle. Peter gritted his teeth, his confidence unraveling with each passing second. You think you can kill me? You're nothing more than a half-step king. And yet here you are, running scared. Brian shot back, his flames intensifying. Face it, Peter. You might have stolen her law, but you don't have the strength to wield it properly. You're nothing without her. Just as he finished speaking, Brian attacked directly with a law skill. Laws were the embodiment of nature's rules, the foundation upon which the world operated. To supernaturals, they were the key to understanding the world and becoming one with it. Law skills were techniques that demonstrated a supernatural's mastery and comprehension of their law. These skills could either be individually created or learned from the blueprint of another's understanding. Blaze of Devoural. The concept behind this law skill was simple yet terrifying. Fire not only burns, it consumes. While this idea was common among fire laws, it was uniquely extreme when tied to Brian's law of eternal embers. The fire summoned by Blaze of Devoural didn't merely scorch. It sought out and consumed any form of energy or material it encountered. Its principle revolved around the absorption of everything into the unyielding flame, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. A ball of concentrated blue flames appeared above Brian's hand, its heat so intense that the surrounding void seemed to ripple and twist. Without hesitation, he hurled it toward Peter. Peter, all too familiar with this devastating move, reacted instantly. His law of Wailing Shadow flared to life. With a sharp motion, he invoked a skill tied to his law. Phantom Abyss. The shadows around him surged, forming a massive whirlpool that sucked into surrounding energy, including the advancing flames. The blue fire resisted fiercely, but the abyss grew deeper, darker, and more oppressive, dragging the flames into its depths. Had they been on the same level, Brian would have undoubtedly emerged victorious. However, the harsh reality was that he was still only a rank 4 cultivator. While his law of eternal embers granted him formidable advantages, his rank imposed significant limitations. Peter's law of Wailing Shadows wasn't inherently superior to Brian's law of eternal embers. However, Peter's rank as a higher-level cultivator gave his law an undeniable edge. For a moment, the void was silent and the two laws battled for supremacy. Then came an explosion of light and darkness as the blaze of Devoural met the heart of the Phantom Abyss. The resulting shockwave sent both men flying, each forced to stabilize themselves as the void trembled under the clash of their powers. Brian wiped the blood trickling from his lip, his eyes burning with determination. Again, without hesitation, Brian launched another attack. For the first time since that fateful day, he had managed to corner his enemy. He was strong, Brian knew that, but he also knew his limitations. By the end of this battle, he could very well be the one to die, and he had accepted that outcome the moment he stepped into this small city. He was ready to give his life. Every day, he still dreamed of his late wife and daughter, their faces haunting him, their voices blaming him for failing to avenge his daughter's deaths. The reason he had sought godhood had been for his daughter, yet the closer he came to understanding nature, the more he realized how insignificant he truly was. As blows were exchanged, Brian's thoughts wandered to the boy he had met just days ago. At first, he hadn't cared much for the rude brat, but after selling those corpses to him, something changed. When the boy returned, he carried an aura Brian was all too familiar with. Death energy. It gave Brian conflicted feelings, but he didn't hate the boy. Like his daughter, though the boy seemed greedy and carried a certain ruthlessness, perhaps driven by an urgent goal, Brian couldn't help but be impressed by his rapid growth. It reminded him of her. Everything reminded him of her. He wondered what might have been if she were still alive. If she had managed to ascend to the rank of King Cultivator. What if she had awakened? What heights could she have reached? The thought gnawed at him, even as he fought with all his strength. Chapter 125 Progress. Michael didn't know how much time had passed, but at some point he found himself fighting level 3 monsters in the third wave. More monsters also began flooding into the community from outside, their numbers growing exponentially. Bone armor. If there was one thing Michael could say he loved about this chaotic mess, it was twofold. First, the experience points. Nothing could beat that. Michael wasn't even the one benefiting the most from the monstrous horde. It was his undead, being at lower levels than him. They leveled up faster and, before long, had caught up to Michael's own level. Well, his previous level. Status window. Name, Michael Norman. Class, Adept Necromancer. Level, 17. EXP, 1,321/39,867. All he knew was that he had leveled up twice. However, he hadn't even had time to properly check his status before rushing after the next group of monsters. And as for increasing his stats, Michael didn't see the point yet. The rank 3 monsters were level 20 at most, and even though he was technically lower level than them, he didn't feel the need to boost any of his stats. These creatures were simply too weak to warrant such action. If they'd all been rare rank monsters, then the situation might have been different. But, fortunately for him, they weren't. All it took was a single swipe of his spear to end them. If one slash wasn't enough, a second would be enough to balance the equation. The second thing Michael was happy about was his skills. At first, he had planned to rely solely on his spear, keeping things simple and straightforward. But during the second wave, when the level 2 sand scorpions were nearly eradicated, an idea struck him. Why not use the opportunity to raise the proficiency of his skills? It wasn't as if his skills were useless. Yes, Michael wasn't just going to milk these monsters for their experience points. He was going to squeeze out every drop of value they could offer through training. And that's exactly what he did. Since the passive skill, spearmanship, had been his most used skill, it naturally saw the most noticeable improvement. The more he fought, the sharper and deadlier his movements became. If not for the knowledge that people were probably dying every minute outside the community, Michael might have thought he was in some kind of heaven. Spearmanship, basic mastery, proficiency, 62.14%. A fundamental skill for wielders of the spear, spearmanship improves the user's control, balance, and precision with this versatile weapon. It focuses on the physical mechanics and practical understanding of spear handling, making it easier to execute basic techniques. Though Michael was pleased with the rapid increase in proficiency of his spearmanship skill, he couldn't help but feel a bit puzzled. Sometimes this was the downside of the skill system. It made it difficult to discern what someone was genuinely talented at. For the average human, the skill system made every awakener look like a genius. This was why Michael found himself questioning things. At first, he had jokingly claimed he had great comprehension since he'd unlocked the skill simply by reading about it. But now, it seemed there was truth in his joke. Perhaps he really did possess extraordinary comprehension and talent in the way of the spear. Of course, he had considered other possibilities. Could it be the result of his increasing intelligence stat? That was plausible, but intelligence primarily affected one's ability to learn magic-related skills or knowledge. Then again, the enhanced cognitive abilities that came as a side effect of higher intelligence might also contribute to his progress. Another possibility was that the spear itself was simply an easier weapon to master, and the skill system made it even easier. Or perhaps it was a combination of all these factors working together. Regardless of the reason, he was getting stronger, and that was enough. Aside from spearmanship, his other skills were also improving, well, with a few exceptions. Share senses was tricky to use in the midst of battle. Unfortunately, Michael couldn't act like a blind spearman with vision of 2 places at once while having to rely solely on his own senses to monitor his surroundings. For now, at least. As for skills like undead summoning and undead revival, they couldn't be used for obvious reasons. One skill, however, had recently stood out to Michael. Acid Shot, basic mastery, proficiency, 12.07%. Acid Shot allows the user to launch a corrosive projectile that melts through materials and deals continuous damage. Range can be launched up to 5 meters. At first, Michael hadn't appreciated Acid Shot much, but now he realized its potential. Unlike a chemically created solution, Acid Shot was fueled entirely by his mana that was not only 100 times greater than that of the average human, but also exceptionally pure. With such high-quality mana as fuel, the corrosive effects of the skill were devastating. He'd proven this when he used it on a sand scorpion, a creature with good rock-like defenses. The acid melted through its carapace as though it were paper. Additionally, although the skill description stated it worked as a projectile, Michael discovered that when he manually manipulated it, he could create a continuous stream. This, of course, drained his mana significantly, but added another layer of versatility to the skill. It was yet another reminder that the system often didn't reveal everything about the true potential of some things. And Acid Shot wasn't the only skill with hidden depths. There was another skill Michael had grown fond of ever since it appeared. Bone Spear, intermediate mastery, proficiency, 19.2%. Bone Spear summons a sharp, ethereal spear made of bone to pierce through enemies. Travels up to 10 meters. Michael had always wondered why the range of this skill was so low despite being at intermediate mastery. That was until he discovered its true nature. Not only was there no limit to the number of spears he could create, the only restriction being his mana, but the 10-meter range, specified in the skill description, simply referred to the area within which he could control the projectile's direction. To Michael, it felt like some kind of domain skill, which made it even cooler in his eyes. It quickly became his fastest method of clearing enemies in the midst of a crowd. However, The sheer computational power required to control a large number of spears at once was staggering. Once the number of projectiles reached a certain threshold, the mental strain became terrifying. Also, at intermediate mastery, it gained proficiency points at an exceptionally slow rate. Chapter 126 Situation. Then there was the slow curse skill, which Michael discovered could be applied to multiple targets simultaneously. The only trade-off was increased mana consumption and a shorter duration of the curse's effect. As for bone armor, Michael activated and deactivated it repeatedly, even deliberately allowing himself to get hit so he could heal the damaged sections and raise the skill's proficiency points. All of this drained a significant amount of his mana, but not enough to worry him or push him to allocate attribute points to his intelligence. However, amidst all this chaos, there was one skill Michael loved the most, aside from Bone Spear, and that was Corpse Explosion. Corpse Explosion, Basic Mastery, Proficiency, 8.7%. Corpse Explosion detonates the remains of a defeated enemy, causing a devastating area attack. Explosion radius, 4 The monsters emerging from the level 3 cracks were the same. Long-armed monkeys, standing at least 2 meters tall, their short legs and arms as long as their bodies gave them an odd appearance. But to Michael, their limbs weren't their most attracting feature. What bothered him was the color of their fur. It was bright pink. For a moment, the entire scene felt surreal. Michael didn't mind the color pink, but it was simply too vibrant, too colorful to say. It clashed harshly with the grim, battle-ridden environment. Grabbing one of the corpses of a long-armed monkey, Michael activated Corpse Explosion. The skill was mana-intensive, but its effects were devastating. According to Michael's observations, the skill allowed him to infuse mana into a corpse, forming intricate magic pathways that turned the body into a volatile container. By using the lingering energy within the corpse, combined with his own mana, he could create a deadly bomb. The power of the explosion depended on several factors: the strength of the corpse, the amount of mana used, and the size of the body. It had its limitations, but in situations like this, it was an incredibly effective weapon. Michael hurled the prepared corpse toward a group of long-armed monkeys charging at one of his undead. The corpse struck one of the monsters, and in a cold, emotionless tone, Michael commanded, "Explode." Boom! The corpse detonated instantly, tearing apart the group of monkeys. 3 died on the spot, their bodies reduced to mangled remains, while a 4th, just slightly outside the 4-meter blast radius, was injured. In one move, Michael had eliminated 4 enemies with a single corpse. That was the sheer destructive power of Corpse Explosion. Of course, the damage depended on the mana he poured into the corpse and the quality of the body itself. The stronger the corpse, the more devastating the explosion, and the greater the mana cost. As for the word he spoke before the explosion, wasn't necessary. The activation was tied purely to his will, but saying it aloud helped solidify the mental image, ensuring the corpse exploded exactly when he intended. Michael had one of his undead finish off the injured monster and didn't stop. He charged through several more, tossing explosive corpses now and then. He couldn't help but admire the effect. For the first time, he understood why Mira seemed so excited about blowing things up. It was art. Explosion is art. Each blast sent shockwaves through the air, scattering the monsters and leaving destruction in its wake. The satisfaction of seeing it all unfold was oddly fulfilling. Between the explosions, Michael had his undead handle any survivors, ensuring no monster was left standing. Amid the chaos, he pulled out his phone, glanced at it, and quickly put it back. No message. No signal. Something's definitely wrong, he muttered. This world was far more advanced than Earth, even if Woodstone City didn't fully reflect that. Regardless of how chaotic the current situation was, it shouldn't have been enough to bring down network service. So it could only mean one thing. The lack of signal on his phone wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. It must be the work of the demonic supernaturals, Michael speculated. Just because he hadn't encountered any in his community didn't mean they weren't involved. In fact, they had already been participating in this mess from the very moment they summoned these cracks into the real world. Still, regardless of the broader situation, Michael's immediate task was to clear the monsters around him. Even so, he kept part of his focus on the bigger picture. He didn't particularly care about the Federation's reaction if something extreme was to happen, though he'd do his best to avoid antagonizing them. However, if a major event forced him to choose between the public and his family, his decision was clear. He'd choose his family. If possible, he'd also save parts of the public, so his family could be included in the public he saved to reduce any complications. But when it came down to it, his family would always come first. As these thoughts churned through his mind, Michael continued casting his skills and killing monsters, unaware of what was unfolding in other parts of the city. In a location far from Michael's apartment, Mira and Lillian stood side by side with a group of other supernaturals. This was another community, much better maintained than Michael's. Even in its ruined state, it was clear this place had been a cut above before chaos descended. Compared to Michael's community, where elevators and tall buildings no longer functioned, this one at least had some semblance of modern convenience. Perhaps because of the better environment, there were more supernaturals here, and not just more, but stronger ones as well. While Lillian and Mira were among the powerful individuals in Michael's community, here, they weren't the strongest. The most powerful person in this area was an old cultivator who, as introductions revealed, was a retired soldier. Soldiers still existed in this world, but their role carried a unique meaning. With no internal wars within the Federation aside from conflicts with demonic supernaturals, soldiers were primarily needed for battles within dimensional cracks. And this wasn't just any soldier who had passed through a military academy. He was a cultivator. A late-stage rank 3 cultivator, no less. If Michael were present and aware of this fact, an old thought would undoubtedly resurface. Why are old people in the Federation so strong? Chapter 1, 27 New Formulas. One might wonder why Lillian was with Mira, given that they lived in different areas. For one, they had become the best of friends, brought together by their shared status as the only 2 females in their class to awaken and become awakeners. Lillian, like Michael, was an orphan, or at least she considered herself one. Lillian wasn't placed in an orphanage because her parents died, but because she was abandoned as a baby, left on the doorstep of an orphanage. The caretakers were terrible. Lillian was a slow learner, and while most adults might have sighed in frustration, the ones in charge of the orphanage were much harsher. They berated her, insulted her, and even revealed the harsh truth of her abandonment in front of the other children. And children, as anyone should know, are capable of cruelty if left unchecked. Bullying became the least of Lillian's worries. Life took a turn for the better when she entered senior high school and was adopted by a kind old woman. Finally, she was able to leave the orphanage. At school, most of her peers barely noticed her existence, and the occasional teasing was harmless compared to the torment she had endured. Her time with the old woman, though brief, was a source of solace. Tragically, the woman passed away a year later, leaving Lillian alone once more. But by then, she had learned how to fend for herself. Using the phone the old woman had gifted her, she began writing short stories on various platforms, earning just enough to survive. Then everything changed on the day the system panel appeared before her. Unlike her peers, Lillian lacked any standout talent or unique ability as an awakener, or so it seemed at first glance. Yet, she adapted, as she always had, living alone and expecting little from the world. She never blamed anyone for her circumstances and never felt entitled to care or kindness. So, when Mira, the only person she could truly call friend, called her, she didn't hesitate. And now, here she was, standing beside Mira, defending her community without hesitation or guilt that she left hers. It was the least she could do for one of the few people who treated her like an actual friend and a real person. Or at least, that's how Lillian saw it from her perspective. Someone who claimed she didn't need anyone but desperately wanted and needed someone to talk to. Someone who treated her normally. Girl, do you have any of that paper? The old cultivator turned toward Mira. Unlike Michael's community, this area was less destroyed and the casualties were notably fewer. The presence of a rank 3 cultivator, along with 2 young awakeners, though not advanced to rank 1 yet, but strong in their own right, played a significant role. Additionally, a few other supernaturals added to the defense. But the true reason for the community's relative safety lay with Mira. Mira had developed a way for even weaker supernaturals to fight more effectively, all thanks to the 2 coincidentally linked formulas she had unlocked at levels 5 and 10. Talismans. At level 5, Mira unlocked the Talisman Formula section, gaining her first 2 talisman-related formulas. While her initial formula, a potion for explosive effects, aligned with her natural talent for destruction, the 2 talismans she acquired were different. So, unfortunately, her talent didn't extend to enhancing them directly. However, their utility couldn't be denied. Feather Light Talisman. Effect: increases speed by 20%. Duration: depends on the strength of the user. Usage: place on the body and infuse mana. Wind/Talisman. Effect: condenses the wind element in the air to launch a sharp attack. Usage: infuse mana into it. Talismans, much like magic scrolls, provided strategic advantages in combat. Despite not being explosive, the 2 talismans proved instrumental in bolstering the defense of the community, especially for those who lacked the raw power to fight monsters head-on. Mira pulled out a bundle of talisman papers. Knowing that the old cultivator was asking for the other supernaturals around, and not for himself, since he was far too strong to need her talismans, Mira reluctantly handed them over to the few Rank 2 cultivators around. Rank 1 cultivators, if they weren't mages, couldn't manipulate mana outside, or even within themselves, even if it was little, until Rank 2, so they couldn't use Talisman. This was where magic scrolls had an edge, since ordinary people are able to use it, since one just needed to tear the one-time item. However, Mira still preferred Talisman. For one, talismans, unlike magic scrolls, were reusable until the energy within their inscriptions was depleted. While magic scrolls were more potent and could seal stronger spells for longer periods, talismans were cheaper, easier to make, and more flexible in usage. Of course, this flexibility came with a drawback. Talismans had a shorter lifespan than magic scrolls. However, given the materials for talismans were far more common, Mira considered the trade-off more than worthwhile. Also, unlike her previous creation, the mushroom potion, which acted as an explosive but required rare and expensive materials, limiting how many she could make, Mira was quite fond of the talismans. While they weren't explosive like she preferred, their materials were cheaper, and the process to make them wasn't too difficult. Perhaps this was because she was an awakener with a crafting skill that boosted her success rate, making the process smoother. After the recent hunt with Michael, Mira had managed to buy enough materials, magic paper and ink, to create 20 talismans of each formula within a day. The best part? They were highly sellable, capable of earning her more than twice what she had spent on materials. Initially, Mira had planned to sell the talismans to fund her creations, as her class seemed to demand a lot of resources. But chaos had descended, ruining her plans. Now, for the sake of protecting the community, she had to give away these talismans, one she had worked so hard to create, for free. She didn't regret her decision. No one would have known she even had these talismans if she hadn't spoken up. Still, that didn't mean she didn't feel the sting of her loss. She felt it. A lot. At this time, the group protecting the community had just finished clearing the second wave. Some had died, and many were injured. Mira and Lillian, however, were reluctantly getting used to the sight. Well, maybe Mira was, but Lillian, at least in her usual state, still struggled. Yes, her usual state. Mira had noticed it ever since their hunt in the Goblin world. Something Michael had also picked on a bit in the Ape region. Lillian wasn't exactly a normal girl. On the surface, she seemed ordinary enough, clumsy, quiet, and unassuming. But the moment she drew her weapon and spilled blood, something changed. It was as though a suppressed lunatic was unleashed, one who grew visibly excited at the sight of blood and fought with an intensity that bordered on madness. Worse, Lillian wasn't just some reckless berserker. She was a highly skilled combatant, her class giving her a natural edge in battle. This transformation only occurred in the heat of a fight. Outside of combat, she reverted to the shy, clumsy girl Mira had first come to know. While this change freaked Mira out a little, she had come to accept it. Find more to read at Empire. What Mira didn't realize, though, was how others viewed her in turn. In their eyes, she wasn't much better than Lillian. During battle, Mira transformed into something entirely different, violent and wild. To outsiders, the two were a peculiar pair, an expressionless ice princess and a shy, sunny girl in normal circumstances. But in the chaos of battle, they were both crazed warriors. After the second wave, the group cleared the surroundings a little and waited anxiously for the third wave. Mira glanced up at her apartment window. The light wasn't on, but she knew her mother was inside. Mira didn't know how her mother felt about all this, but she knew one thing. If she wanted to keep her safe, her place was outside, fighting, not hiding indoors. Still, Mira wasn't overly worried. She had left some means of protection for her mother, 2 pairs of mushroom potions. She felt uneasy in trusting her mom with something so volatile, especially since the potion only needed to be shaken violently to explode. However, since her mom was an ordinary person with no ability to manipulate mana and activate the talisman she had made, this was the best Mira could do. Despite her worries, Mira reassured herself that as long as no monster reached her mother, everything would be fine. Yet, alongside her worry, there was anger simmering beneath the surface. If there were people in Woodstone City who knew about the actions of the supernaturals and didn't feel anger, Lillian might be among them. But for Mira, and a few others like her, that indifference didn't exist. Just like Michael, Mira didn't care much about most people. But for the select few she did care about, her feelings ran deep. And now, the thought of some group of lunatics trying to take her mother away from her filled her with fury. The battle in the city raged on. More lives were lost. Some grew stronger amidst the chaos. Others lost everything they held dear. And a few, like Brian, found themselves at the most pivotal moments of their lives. Boom! Brian didn't know how long he'd been trading blows, but it felt like an eternity. At this point, his appearance had changed drastically. His hair was now snow white, not with the elegance of age, but the pallor of illness. His body had grown gaunt and pale, exuding a heavy sense of weakness despite the terrifying aura radiating from him. Also, his left arm was missing. Give up, cough, cough. In the void, Peter tried once more to persuade Brian to surrender, only to end up coughing blood. His face turned ashen. He knew his time was running out. If the battle dragged on any longer, he wouldn't survive. This was why he had never wanted to face the Mad Phoenix. Having a strong law was one thing, but having a law among the strongest was entirely different. Brian's law, the law of eternal embers. Peter had often called it the nemesis of nearly everything, even those of its kind. In the beginning, Peter had held the upper hand. As a rank 5 cultivator with a more complete law, his energy far exceeded Brian's. Though the law of eternal embers was a force that consumed anything and everything for energy, it functioned much like feeding a dog. No matter how much it could eat, there was always a limit, and it couldn't be fed its entire capacity all at once. Similarly, while the law of eternal embers could devour most things, it had its own constraints. Yet, countering it was even more challenging, as attempting to extinguish its flames with an overwhelming surge of law energy often backfired, turning the excess energy into fuel for its insatiable fire. However, even a rank 5 cultivator had his limits. Now, Peter was barely holding on. The only thing keeping him alive was the thin barrier of energy coating his body, shielding him from the flames. But it was a temporary measure. The law of eternal embers continued to feed on his energy, growing stronger with every passing moment. The void they were trapped in was in shambles, chaotic energy tearing through it, threatening to collapse at any moment. Yet Brian, holding a treasure that could have allowed him to escape, made no move to leave. One of them was going to die here, and Brian had already decided. The sea of blue flames swirled around him, their glow illuminating his gaunt figure as he spoke. His voice was deep and calm, unshaken by the chaos around him. Have you ever regretted killing Isabella in these past 50 years? Peter had initially been relieved seeing Brian finally open his mouth to speak. Ever since the first blow was thrown, not a single word had been exchanged between them. Seeing Brian turn to address him made Peter almost believe the Mad Phoenix wasn't as suicidal as he seemed. However, it was clear he thought too much. Or rather, thought too soon. What bullshit are you talking about? Peter finally snapped. He barely had any energy left, and he could feel the terrifying flames of the law of eternal embers closing in on him. Any moment now, if the flames touched his physical body, it would be over. The fear of death clawed at him, and the words he expected didn't come. Brian repeated his question. Have you ever regretted killing Isabella in these past 50 years? Though his voice was emotionless, there was something in the way he said it. If Peter had paid attention, he might have noticed how much this question meant to Brian. And it did. Brian didn't expect this to change the result of their battle, but he wanted to know. He wanted to know if Peter, the friend he had once trusted, laughed with, and shared everything with, still existed somewhere beneath the bitterness and hatred. Why the hell would I care about her? Why? Why would I care about the daughter of the woman you stole from me? Why did Lyra choose you and not me? Why? Why has everything always gone your way? Why? Why are you so much better than me? Why? Explore more stories with Empire. Peter's voice cracked as the words tumbled out, his tears falling freely. Brian didn't respond. He stood there silently as every word hit him like a blade. He had suspected Peter's bitterness, but hadn't realized just how deeply it ran. Memories flooded his mind. For the first time, Brian questioned himself. Had he really been a good friend? But that didn't matter anymore. Whatever Peter's reasons, whatever his bitterness, it didn't excuse Isabella's death. She was innocent. She hadn't deserved to die for her father's actions. Brian's grief and anger burned brighter than ever. He didn't wait for Peter's energy to be fully depleted. Blaze of devoural. No, Peter screamed, his voice full of despair. Goodbye, friend, Brian said softly. And then the flames consumed everything. At first, driven by the rage that had consumed him throughout the battle, Brian planned to slowly burn Peter to ashes if he emerged victorious. But in the end, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Not to his old friend. Instead, he granted Peter a quick death. It might not have been painless, but it was swift. If reincarnation exists, I hope your next life treats you better, Brian murmured. His focus shifted elsewhere. Though he had erased Peter's existence from the world, Brian hadn't truly destroyed everything of his. Not completely. Well, in truth, what remained was never really Peter's to begin with. Isabella, Brian whispered, his gaze falling to the darkness, swirling in his palm. A lost seed. This small object carried a connection to two of the most important people in his heart. A lost seed was an incredibly rare resource. With it, a peak rank 4 cultivator could immediately begin advancing toward rank 5, making it highly sought after. It could also be consumed by those who had comprehended a law, but had yet to fuse it into their own seed, accelerating their progress. Even rank 5 cultivators coveted such seeds to speed their cultivation. But Brian had no intention of using it in the traditional sense. Not when it was the last tangible connection to his daughter. Clothing and material possessions decayed over time. They could be carefully preserved, but their meaning could never compare to what this organ in his hand represented. With this, I've avenged you, Isabella. Lida, I am sorry. Peter, why? In the end, the ever-cold Brian broke down, tears spilling from his eyes. For the sake of vengeance, he had sacrificed everything. But in doing so, the bottleneck that had trapped him for so long began to loosen. Freed from the shackles of hatred, the once stagnant barrier to rank 5 cultivation started to dissolve. A terrifying aura emanated from Brian's body as his sobs subsided. I guess what remains now is to... His voice grew firm. Become a god. It was the goal he had promised to the 3 people who mattered most to him. For the first time in a long while, Brian felt that hunger for power reignite within him. He glanced down at the lost seed in his hand. Perhaps, after reaching the godly realm, he could finally fulfill that. Determined, Brian sat cross-legged in the void, his expression resolute. King rank, emperor rank, demigod rank, and even that rank. My journey starts here. On the day countless lives were lost, a phoenix was reborn, one that would scorch everything in its path to achieve its goal. Outside the void, Michael surveyed his surroundings with a deep frown etched on his face. The steadily decreasing number of monsters made it clear that the level 3 cracks were beginning to close, but the devastation they left behind was undeniable. The battlefield was already overflowing with corpses, despite Michael's best efforts to manage the chaos in the little time he had. The sheer number and size of the fallen monsters had transformed the area into a grotesque landscape of death. Around the community, hills of scattered flesh and gore piled high. The fighting itself, now, took place atop heaps of bodies and rivers of blood. While Michael had not been affected by it, and even benefited from the corpses surrounding him, the presence of so many corpses distracted him. It wasn't the sight of the corpses that disturbed Michael. It was the human corpses that caught his attention. Michael had never created a human undead before. For a brief moment, curiosity took hold of him. He wondered what the evolution of a human undead would look like. How would it be different from his usual creations? Would there be a distinction between a normal human corpse and that of a cultivator? The temptation to take a few bodies into his storage space flickered in his mind. No one would notice, after all. But as soon as the thought crossed his mind, Michael felt a jolt of shock. What was he thinking? He quickly corrected himself, but the sight of the corpses and the lingering greed gnawed at the edges of his resolve. For a fleeting moment, his thoughts drifted elsewhere. With the disappearance of the level 3 cracks, Michael leveled up to level 18. From the start of the chaos until now, Michael had leveled up 3 times. He wasn't sure how to feel about it. Should he be glad that he finally found an opportunity to level up as he wanted, or should he feel guilty about the circumstances that allowed it? For a moment, Michael felt a heavy weight in his chest. However, the feeling was fleeting, and a serious expression soon replaced it. Michael turned his gaze to the sky. The number of cracks had visibly reduced, and the sky was now clearer and easier to look at. But the clearer sky didn't ease Michael's mood. This time, it wasn't about greed or the dwindling number of monsters that would appear. No, it was the level of the monsters that concerned him now. Level 4 monsters. In the cultivation power system, every advancement after the 3rd rank was a significant leap, far more so than the ranks before it. Continue your journey with Empire. Michael had only been a supernatural for a few days, so it was hard to claim he knew much. Still, thanks to his occasional browsing of the Supers Association forum, he understood more now than he had pre-awakening. While the specifics of advancing to rank 4 were still a mystery to him, he knew enough to recognize its significance. The leap from rank 3 to rank 4 was much harder than the previous advancements, which made sense given the massive power difference. For cultivators, rank 4 granted not just more power, but also new abilities like the ability to fly, an extended lifespan, and greater limits. Michael wasn't fully aware of all the intricacies, but he understood one thing. The monsters now coming through the cracks were on a whole different level of strength. Rank 4 monsters corresponded to rank 2 monsters in the Awakener's grading system, which meant a rank 4 monster started at level 26. This was a level even Michael had to take seriously. Why wouldn't he? He wasn't remotely qualified to look down on such monsters. It was also said that the next rank of monsters in the cultivation system, rank 5, was even stronger. The forum posts he had read didn't reveal much, but Michael had every reason to believe that a rank 5 monster matched the strength of a rank 5 cultivator. What made things worse was the presence of a level 5 crack above the scattered level 4 cracks. At a glance, The level 5 crack looked similar in size to the other level 4 cracks. However, Michael knew it wasn't the same. He didn't understand the mechanisms behind the current situation, but the level 5 crack had seemed to remain dormant during the first 3 waves. Yet, the moment level 4 cracks became clear to the public, the level 5 crack, once emitting the same energy as a level 4 crack, began to widen, releasing chaotic energy that was entirely different from the others. Michael could see one such crack clearly and faintly sense the aura of 2 more. This did nothing to ease his growing tension. But it wasn't just one monster per crack. So what would happen if more than one level 5 monster appeared in Woodstone City? Putting aside whether he had the ability to protect others, Michael wasn't even sure he'd survive. Level 5 monsters match King rank cultivators, which happened to align with a rank 3 awakener. Michael wasn't entirely sure why the system worked this way, but he assumed there must be some truth to it. As an awakener himself, he could only imagine the strength of a rank 3 awakener. For a cultivator to be compared to that rank, and for a monster to match such power, only emphasized how terrifying such creatures would be. This was why Michael wore a grim expression. Unfortunately, the energy emitted by the level 5 cracks only became distinct after the level 3 cracks had disappeared. If Michael had been aware of a level 5 crack's presence from the beginning of the chaos, he would have chosen a different approach rather than simply standing guard over his community. Does the association have anyone who can handle a level 5 crack? He wondered aloud, though his expectations were low. He doubted the Federation lacked King rank cultivators altogether, but this wasn't the Federation, it was Woodstone City, a city that didn't even attract many supernaturals in the first place. Even if there was a King rank cultivator here, 1 or 2 wouldn't be enough. Michael's mind was in disarray. He couldn't understand how a level 5 crack could have appeared so suddenly. Though he had a theory. Perhaps these weren't actual level 5 cracks at the start. Perhaps, due to some unknown factor, level 4 cracks had mutated into level 5 cracks. Michael suspected this because, while the level 5 crack was tinted red and emanated chaotic energy, showing it was nearing a break, it didn't seem like it would erupt immediately. Even as an amateur in such matters, Michael was confident the crack wouldn't release its monsters for at least another 3 hours. With that small window, there was still time to make preparations. For now, he turned his attention back to the level 4 cracks. Those needed to be dealt with first. Since the situation demanded seriousness, Michael immediately stretched out his hands, summoning the 2 undead who had been left out of the previous waves. These 2 had missed out on the fun of clearing the earlier 3 waves, losing potential experience points in the process. However, had he brought them out from the start, it was hard to say who would have caused more destruction, the undead brothers or the crack monsters. There was another reason Michael had held them back. The rest of his undead needed to remain close to their current levels, not just grow stronger. He hadn't forgotten his experiment with Prince. The stronger the undead before evolving, the stronger it became after evolution, at least in terms of levels. This was why, despite Lucky being of a higher race rank than Prince, they were both at the same level. Prince had evolved into a 3-star rare rank undead at a higher level, while Lucky had reached a similar rank at only level 11. Chapter 130 Griffins. The experiment with Prince had helped Michael figure out the best way to maximize the value of his undead's evolution. Make them stronger before evolution to create even more powerful undead after. That was the formula. Unfortunately, Michael hadn't had much time in the past few days to dedicate to strengthening his undead. To make them stronger, they needed experience points, something Michael also didn't have an abundance of. However, that would change in the future, once he was no longer in constant rush mode and could devote time to other pursuits. Looking at Lucky and Prince, who were now standing before him, busy inspecting their appearances, a trace of worry flickered in Michael's eyes. The brothers were strong, no doubt, and had recovered from their battle with that corrupted creature in the ruins of his initial location in the land of origin. But they weren't yet back to their peak and still carried hidden injuries within their bodies. Setting aside the current crisis, it would already be a miracle if they emerged from this without worsening their injuries. Michael suspected that evolution might restore the undead to their peak state, essentially healing them, but it was only a suspicion, not something he could confirm. So, aside from ensuring they could fully exert their power, he also had to be cautious about preventing their hidden injuries from getting worse. Hopefully, the level 4 monsters aren't too strong, Michael muttered. The incoming monsters would be at least level 26, but their difficulty would heavily depend on their race rank. If they were 1-star rare rank creatures, Prince, who was a 3-star rare rank, and Lucky, now a 1-star extraordinary rank creature, would easily wipe them out. But if they matched Prince's race rank, the battle would become significantly harder. There was another issue. As poison-type creatures, Prince and Lucky excelled at crowd control with their poison and plant manipulation skills, which covered wide areas. However, Their true strength lay in being deployed as solo units. Whether the battle would be easy like the previous 3 waves, or turn into something far worse would soon be revealed. If the incoming monsters were all just 1-star rare rank creatures at level 26, Michael would crush them with raw strength. But if they were higher rank creatures with higher levels, he'd have no choice but to fight carefully or escape. However, Michael wasn't given much time to plan or organize his thoughts. The moment he summoned Lucky and Prince, monsters began pouring out of the level 4 cracks. What the? Why is everything so different? In the previous 3 crack breaks, there had always been a period of rest before the next wave. But after the 3rd wave, the 4th one came almost immediately, leaving Michael wondering if something abnormal was happening, like the appearance of the level 5 crack. Whatever. Let's just get this done, Michael muttered, planting himself firmly in place. The full appearance of the monsters emerging from the level 4 cracks came into view. Are those griffins? The monsters emerging from the level 4 cracks truly caught Michael off guard. He had grown accustomed to crack monsters falling from the sky to the ground, allowing him and his group to immediately gang up on them for a quick first strike. This time, however, no monsters fell to the floor. Instead, the creatures that emerged were airborne. Eagle wings, sharp eagle claws, an eagle's head, and a lion's body with a tail. Michael's mind immediately jumped to 2 possibilities. The first was a chimera, a stitched-up abomination of a monster, and the second was a griffin, a creature often mentioned in fantasy stories both in this world and on Earth. Taking a closer look at the flying monsters, griffins seemed like the most fitting term to describe them. However, no matter what they were called, one thing remained certain. They were monsters. And monsters were creatures of destruction. The moment Michael spotted the monsters in the air, a grimace spread across his face. Ugh, they can fly, he muttered, his tone laced with frustration. It hadn't even been a day since the exhausting battle against those winged gargoyles, and now, another airborne threat was upon him. The sight of these flying creatures did little to lift his spirits. Stay updated with Empire. But Michael barely had time to process his frustration before reality set in. Monsters emerging from cracks were bloodthirsty creatures of destruction. Their nature was simple: attack anything that wasn't their kind. Specifically, any being not created from negative energy became their target, even if it was another monster. This universal hostility became evident as soon as the griffins appeared. The level 4 cracks weren't directly over Michael's community, but they were high in the sky, looming above it. The moment the griffins spotted their targets, they dove toward them without hesitation. Michael wasn't their only target. Some griffins flew toward other locations, suggesting there were still survivors outside his community. But the largest group of griffins, numbering around 30, charged straight for him. The creatures weren't just reacting to Michael alone. They were drawn to the dense concentration of life within his community. Seeing the swarm of monsters heading directly for him made Michael's heart pound. The aura radiating from the griffins was strong, almost comparable to the winged gargoyles he had fought earlier. However, there was a key difference between the 2 groups of monsters. The gargoyles had been calculated, attacking from a distance, while these griffins, consumed by their corrupted minds, were reckless, choosing to charge straight into close combat. This suited Michael just fine. Attack! Michael didn't waste a second, his voice ringing out as he commanded his undead to engage the incoming horde. Though it seemed like Michael had been addressing all his undead, this couldn't be further from the truth. From the very beginning, his reliance had always been on Lucky and Prince. The others, while useful, couldn't compare to the sheer power of these 2.